Today's story is about a manhunt that sounds like it was written for a Hollywood action movie, but it is 100% true. It involves a man who possessed superhuman endurance, a man who could vanish into thin air, and a man who triggered the first ever aerial police chase in history. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Now, let's get into the story. To understand how impossible this story is, you first have to understand the environment. We are going to the far northern edge of Canada, to the Yukon and Northwest Territories border. The year is 1931. This is a place where the sun barely rises in the winter. The temperature routinely drops to 40, 50, sometimes 60 degrees below zero. It is a land of silence, snow, and death. If you make a mistake here, you do not just get hurt. You freeze solid. In July of 1931, a stranger arrived in the small settlement of Fort McPherson. He was a man of few words. In fact, he barely spoke at all. He was about 35 years old, with piercing blue eyes and a strong, stocky build. He told people his name was Albert Johnson. Now, in the North, people tend to be private. They do not ask too many questions. But Albert Johnson was different. He was not just private. He was hostile. He bought supplies, flour, sugar, a rifle, and ammunition, and then he floated down the Peel River on a makeshift raft. He eventually found a spot on the banks of the Rat River to build a cabin. But this was not a normal cabin. Most trappers build a simple shack to keep the wind out. Albert Johnson built a fortress. He cut down trees and built a small, squat cabin, roughly 8 feet by 10 feet. He sank the logs deep into the frozen ground. He cut shooting ports, small holes in the walls, so he could fire a gun in any direction without being seen. He built the door to be reinforced. It was as if he was preparing for a war. For the first few months, Johnson kept to himself. But in December of 1931, the local indigenous trappers began to notice something strange. Their traps were being triggered. Someone was springing them and hanging them in the trees. This is a huge violation of the unwritten code of the bush. You do not mess with another man's livelihood. The trappers complained to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, or the Mounties. On December 26, 1931, a police officer named Constable Alfred King and a special constable named Joe Bernard decided to pay Albert Johnson a visit. It was a routine check. They just wanted to tell him to knock it off. They trekked 60 miles through the snow to get to Johnson's cabin. When they arrived, they saw smoke curling from the chimney. Johnson was inside. Constable King walked up to the door and knocked. "Mr. Johnson," he called out, "I am Constable King with the RCMP. I need to speak with you." Silence. King knocked again. "Mr. Johnson, open the door!" Inside the cabin, Johnson remained dead silent. But King could hear him moving. He could feel eyes watching him through one of those shooting ports. King looked at Bernard. This was weird. Usually, a lonely trapper is happy to see a friendly face. But Johnson gave them nothing. Without a warrant, the officers could not break in. So, frustrated, they turned around and made the 60-mile trek back to Fort McPherson to get a search warrant. 5 days later, King returned. This time, he brought 3 other officers with him. They had a warrant. They meant business. They approached the cabin. It was dead silent. The snow was piled high around the walls. Constable King walked up to the heavy wooden door. He shouted, "Johnson! Open up! We have a search warrant!" There was no answer. King stepped forward and put his hand on the door to push it open. Boom! A shot rang out from inside the cabin. The bullet punched through the wooden door and slammed into Constable King's chest. King was thrown backward into the snow, blood pouring from his wound. The other officers scrambled for cover behind the trees. They opened fire on the cabin, peppering the logs with bullets. But Johnson had built his fortress well. The bullets just thudded harmlessly into the thick timber. The officers were in a panic. Their friend was bleeding out in the snow, and they were pinned down by a maniac in a bunker. They managed to crawl out, grab King, and drag him to safety. They loaded King onto a dog sled and raced him back to civilization. It was a miracle, but King survived. Now, the gloves were off. You do not shoot a Mountie and get away with it. A posse was formed. It was led by Inspector Eames. He gathered 9 men, 42 dogs, and 20 pounds of dynamite. They were going to blast Albert Johnson out of his hole. On January 9th, 1932, the posse arrived at the cabin. It was 40 degrees below zero. A blizzard was raging. They surrounded the cabin. Inspector Eames shouted for Johnson to surrender. The only answer was a gunshot. The siege began. The police fired hundreds of rounds into the cabin. Johnson returned fire with deadly accuracy. He moved from one shooting port to another, keeping the 9 men at bay. Finally, Inspector Eames had enough. He ordered the dynamite to be brought forward. One of the officers crawled through the snow, lit a fuse on a 4-pound bundle of dynamite, and tossed it onto the roof of the cabin. The explosion was massive. It shattered the silence of the Arctic night. The roof of the cabin collapsed. One of the walls blew out. The cabin was reduced to a smoking pile of rubble. The officers stood up. They lowered their guns. There was no way anyone could have survived that. It was over. They began to walk toward the ruins to recover the body. Suddenly, from the smoking debris, a figure rose up. It was Albert Johnson. He had dug a foxhole inside the floor of his cabin and had hunkered down during the explosion. He popped up like a jack-in-the-box and opened fire. The officers dove into the snow. They could not believe it. This man was unkillable. The weather was getting worse. The officers were freezing. They were running low on food for the dogs. They realized they could not take him that night. So, incredibly, the posse retreated. They left Albert Johnson alone in the ruins of his fortress. When they returned a few days later, Johnson was gone. Thus began the most famous manhunt in Canadian history. Albert Johnson was on the run. But he was not running like a normal man. He was running like a machine. The conditions were horrific. It was now roughly 50 degrees below zero. Most men would die of exposure within hours without a fire and a tent. Johnson had no tent. He had no sleeping bag. He had very little food. And he was being chased by expert trackers and indigenous guides who knew the land better than anyone. But Johnson was always one step ahead. He used tricks that baffled the trackers. He would walk backward in his snowshoes for miles to make it look like he was going the other way. He would walk in the tracks of caribou herds to hide his footprints. At night, he did not build a fire because the smoke would give him away. So, how did he survive? How did he not freeze to death? He dug down into the snowbanks to create tiny insulated caves to sleep in. He ate whatever he could find. Some reports say he chewed on tree bark and raw small game he managed to snare on the run. This is where the legend of his toughness grew. He was consuming the land itself to keep going. The posse chased him for weeks. Every time they thought they had him cornered, he vanished. At one point, Johnson reached a barrier that the police thought would stop him. It was the Richardson Mountains. These are steep, jagged peaks that form a wall between the Yukon and the Northwest Territories. In the dead of winter, they are considered impassable. The police blocked the only 2 passes through the mountains. They sat there, waiting, thinking, "We have him trapped. He has to come through here." But Johnson did not use the passes. In the middle of a blizzard, in pitch-black darkness, Albert Johnson did the impossible. He climbed a 7,000-foot vertical cliff face of ice and rock. He did this without climbing gear, wearing heavy winter clothes, carrying a rifle and a backpack. When the trackers found his tracks at the top of the mountain a few days later, they were stunned. The indigenous guides looked at the cliff and said it was impossible. But the tracks were there. Johnson was superhuman, but the law was catching up. On January 30th, the posse caught up to him in a thick patch of forest. They spotted him. "Surrender, Johnson!" Johnson responded with his rifle. In the chaotic gunfight that followed, a brave young officer named Constable Edgar Millen was shot through the heart. He died instantly. Now, Johnson was a cop killer twice over, or at least he had killed one and wounded another. The Mounties were furious. They were not going to let this man escape. They realized that on foot, they could not match him. Johnson was moving too fast. He was averaging nearly 30 miles a day in deep snow. So they called in a secret weapon. For the first time in the history of police work, they hired an airplane to help in a manhunt. They called in a legendary bush pilot named Wilfred Whop May. Whop May arrived in his Belanca monoplane. He flew over the frozen wilderness looking for tracks. From the air, Johnson could not hide his trail as easily. Whop May could spot the line of footprints leading through the snow and radio the position to the ground team. Johnson heard the plane. He tried to use the tactic of backtracking, walking in circles, confusing the trail. But the plane was relentless. On February 17th, 1932, the end finally came. The plane spotted Johnson walking down the middle of the frozen Eagle River. The high banks of the river made it hard for him to climb out quickly. The ground team, following the pilot's signals, came around the bend of the river. There he was, the mad trapper. He was about 300 yards away. He saw the police sleds coming. He saw the plane circling overhead. He knew there was nowhere left to run. Albert Johnson didn't try to talk. He didn't try to surrender. He just dropped to his knees, dug a shallow trench in the snow, and raised his rifle. The police officers fanned out. They yelled for him to give up. Johnson fired. The shootout on the Eagle River was intense. Bullets were flying everywhere, kicking up sprays of ice and snow. Whop May, the pilot, was circling above, watching the whole thing. He later said it looked like a war scene. Johnson was hit, but he kept firing. He was hit again. He kept firing. Finally, a bullet severed his spine. The firing stopped. The officers waited. The wind howled over the ice. Slowly, carefully, they approached the body. Albert Johnson lay face down in the snow. He was dead. His body was a wreck. He was emaciated. He weighed less than 100 pounds. His face was sunken, his skin waxy from frostbite and starvation. He had practically eaten nothing for a month, yet he had outrun a team of well-fed men and dogs for 150 miles. But the mystery of the mad trapper did not end with his death. In fact, it only got deeper. When they searched his body, they found a few $1,000s in cash, a huge amount for 1932. They found some gold teeth in his pocket, which was strange. They found a compass, a knife, and some pills. But they did not find a single piece of identification. No wallet, no letters, no name. Albert Johnson was just a name he had given when he arrived. It was an alias. They took his fingerprints. They sent them to the FBI in America, to Scotland Yard in England, to police forces all over Canada. No match. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody knew why he had come to the Arctic. Nobody knew why he hated the police so much that he was willing to die rather than just talk to them about some beaver traps. For decades, theories ran wild. Was he a bank robber from Chicago hiding out? Was he a draft dodger from World War I? Was he a mentally unstable hermit? They exhumed his body, dug it up several times over the years to do DNA testing. Finally, in 2021, nearly 90 years after the shootout, a team of genetic investigators made a breakthrough. Using advanced DNA genealogy, they linked the mad trapper to a family in Sweden. His real name, they believe, was Patrick Ginter. But even with a name, we still do not have the why. We do not know what snapped in his mind. We do not know what darkness he was running from that made the frozen hell of the Canadian Arctic seem like a safe haven. What we do know is that for 48 days, one man waged a war against nature and the law. He survived explosions, starvation, and the bitter cold, fueled by a rage that kept him warm when the fire could not. He was the man who ate trees. He was the man who refused to break. And in the end, it took an army, an airplane, and a bullet to stop the ghost of the Rat River. So, if you are ever in the Yukon and you hear the wind howling through the canyons, just remember, sometimes the most dangerous thing in the woods isn't the cold or the bears. It's a man who has nothing left to lose. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. I hope you're having a strange, dark, and mysterious day, because today we are hitting the road for a classic piece of Americana, the vanishing hitchhiker legend. But this isn't the story your grandmother told you. This is a real-life, documented account from a lonely stretch of highway where the spectral and the physical world collided, leaving behind a terrifying mystery. This is the story of the vanishing hitchhiker of Route 12. Before we dive into the deep end of the mysterious, do me a favor. If you enjoy this type of content, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and let me know in the comments what city you are watching this video from. Your support helps me keep telling these strange, dark, and mysterious stories. Our story centers on a specific, desolate stretch of highway known as Route 12, winding its way through the rugged, sparsely populated mountains of upstate New York. It's a road notorious for its hairpin turns, thick fog, and a long, tragic history of fatal accidents. The specific incident we're focusing on occurred in the dead of winter, in the year 1985. Our protagonist is a man named James Donovan. James was a traveling salesman for a regional paper company, a job that kept him on the road constantly. He was a skeptical, pragmatic man, utterly grounded in reality. He was driving his beat-up Ford sedan, heading back toward Albany after a long, unsuccessful day trying to close a deal in a remote town near the Canadian border. It was nearly 11 o'clock p.m. The temperature was well below freezing, and a thick, unnatural fog had rolled in, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The radio was fading in and out, the static almost as loud as the distant whine of his engine. James was driving slowly, nervously peering through the misty beam of his headlights when he saw her. Standing on the shoulder of the road, directly illuminated by his high beams, was a young woman. She was clearly in distress. She was wearing a thin, pale blue formal dress completely inappropriate for the freezing weather. Her dark hair was wet, plastered against her pale face, and she was standing stiffly, her thumb out, shivering violently. She looked like she had wandered out of a high school prom and into a nightmare. James, despite his exhaustion and his common sense telling him not to stop on a dark, foggy road, couldn't leave her there. He slowed down, pulled the sedan onto the snowy shoulder, and rolled down the passenger window. The moment he saw her face up close, he felt a wave of profound unease. Her eyes were wide, dark, and fixed on him with an expression of pure, bone-deep terror. "Where are you going?" James asked, trying to sound friendly. The girl's voice was barely a whisper. "The bridge. I need to get to the old covered bridge, just up the road. Please, I have to get there now." Quote, James knew the bridge she meant. It was about 3 miles further down Route 12. It was an iconic, but very remote, landmark. "All right, hop in." "You're freezing," he said, reaching across to unlock the passenger door. The girl quickly opened the door and slid into the seat. The moment she settled beside him, James was hit by an intense wave of cold. It was far colder than the outside air, a chilling, damp cold that seemed to radiate directly from her body. He pulled back onto the highway. "My name is James. What's yours?" "Eliza," she replied, her voice still thin and strained. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead on the road, watching the fog-shrouded path ahead. James tried to make small talk, asking her what she was doing out here, who she was with, and why she was wearing a summer dress. Eliza's replies were short, fragmented, and strange. She mumbled something about a terrible argument and having to leave. She kept repeating that she was late and that she had to warn them. As they drove, James noticed something else disturbing. Despite the overwhelming cold she exuded, there was no sign of condensation, frost, or even a single shiver visible on her skin. She was perfectly, chillingly still. He glanced down at his dashboard. The thermometer gauge was inexplicably climbing, not dropping. The interior of the car was getting hotter, yet the cold radiating from Eliza was making James's side of the car feel like a freezer. They had been driving for about 5 minutes when the fog suddenly thickened, becoming an opaque, blinding wall of white. James had to slow the car down to barely 10 miles per hour. "Almost there," Eliza whispered, her voice tightening with dread. "It's coming." "What's coming, Eliza? The bridge?" "No," she said, her voice now dangerously calm. The sound of the car hitting the guardrail. James's blood ran cold. The way she said it was not a prediction. It was a statement of fact, a memory. He realized the horror of the situation. He wasn't giving a ride to someone in trouble. He was giving a ride to someone who had already been in trouble. He slammed on the brakes, pulling the car to a shuddering halt in the middle of the empty highway. "Eliza, what are you talking about? Who are you?" he demanded, turning to face her. She finally looked at him. Her face was no longer pale. It was completely translucent, the color of milky glass. Her wide, dark eyes held an expression of infinite sorrow and regret. "I tried to tell them. I was supposed to be here," she said, her voice fading to a wispy echo. "But I ran. I never should have left the dance." Then, from the fog directly ahead of them, came a sound. It was the sickening, unmistakable sound of grinding metal, followed by the shattering noise of glass exploding and a low, terrible crunch. The sounds were deafening, visceral, and felt incredibly close. James instinctively covered his head, bracing for impact. But the sounds faded instantly, replaced by the profound, heavy silence of the snowy road. The car hadn't moved. James realized the sounds hadn't come from a new accident. They were echoes, residual noise caught in the terrifying vortex that was Eliza. He looked back at the passenger seat. The seat was empty. Eliza was gone. There was no sound of a door opening or closing, no tracks in the snow outside the door. She had simply vanished. But she had left something behind. On the black vinyl of the passenger seat, there was a small puddle of water, not frozen, not melted, but perfectly room temperature, and lying in the center of the water was a piece of jewelry. A tiny, silver locket, slightly tarnished. James didn't hesitate. He jammed the gear shift into drive and sped away, not stopping until he reached the lights of the next town, nearly 30 miles away. He didn't report the incident to the police immediately. He knew how absurd his story sounded. Instead, the next day, using the information he gleaned from local historical records, he drove back to the small town near the Canadian border. He went to the local library and started digging through old newspaper archives from the 1960s. He found it on the third day. A yellowed clipping from the town paper, dated November 24th, 1962. The headline read, "Tragedy Strikes Prom Night. 3 high schoolers killed in Route 12 crash." The article detailed how 3 students, 2 boys and a girl, had died in a massive car crash after leaving a high school dance. They had hit a patch of ice, slid, and slammed into the guardrail near the covered bridge. The names of the victims were listed. One of the names was Eliza Thorne. The article also mentioned a significant detail. Eliza was the only one in the vehicle who survived the initial impact, but she had been thrown from the car and had died hours later from exposure and injuries on the shoulder of the road. She was found still clutching a silver locket. The police determined the crash was caused by excessive speed, but the students' families maintained that the car had veered to avoid something they never identified. James Donovan now understood. Eliza wasn't warning him of the crash. She was a restless spirit, reenacting her final moments, forever hitchhiking back to the crash site where she should have warned her friends and where she ultimately died alone. The sounds James heard were the auditory remnants of the tragedy, the final, brutal noise of the car wreck that defined her death. James returned to the area near the old covered bridge. He found the exact stretch of road where he had stopped. He used a shovel to dig a small hole in the snow on the shoulder of the road, right where he had picked her up. He placed the silver locket into the hole, covered it with earth, and said a simple prayer for peace. He never saw Eliza again, but the story doesn't quite end there. 10 years later, in 1995, Route 12 was undergoing major construction. A team of road workers was widening the lane near the old covered bridge when they made an unexpected discovery. Buried just beneath the guardrail, they found the wreckage of an old Ford Fairlane from the 1960s. The car from the original tragedy, which had apparently been thrown over the embankment and buried by subsequent snow and repairs. And next to the car, they found the remains of 2 bodies. They were identified as the 2 male passengers from the accident. But only 2 bodies were accounted for. The police also found something else, a long, deep gouge in the pavement leading directly to the fatal spot. The gouge was much too clean and sharp to have been made by the initial impact. The road crew workers, when debriefed by the local sheriff, reported one strange detail. For the entire week they worked near that spot, they had battled an inexplicable, dense, localized fog that defied weather reports. And occasionally, late at night, when their work lights were on, they swore they could hear the faint, high-pitched scrape of something hard being dragged across the asphalt, desperately trying to get back to the crash site. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the strange, dark, and mysterious story of the vanishing hitchhiker of Route 12. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Today's story is about one of the most baffling maritime mysteries in modern history. Usually, when we talk about ghost ships, we are talking about folklore or legends from the 1800s, like the Flying Dutchman stories, that are half myth and half rumor. But today's story is about a real 1,300-ton steel cargo steamer, a ship that was abandoned by its crew, declared lost, and then proceeded to sail the Arctic Ocean alone, without a captain, without a crew, and without fuel, for nearly 4 decades. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Now, let's get into the story. To understand how a massive steel ship can become a ghost, we first have to go to the frozen edge of the world. We are going to the Canadian Arctic and the coast of Alaska. The year is 1931. The ship in question was called the SS Bechimo. She was a tough, sturdy vessel. Originally built in Sweden, she was purchased by the Hudson's Bay Company. If you know anything about the history of the North, you know the Hudson's Bay Company was the titan of the fur trade. They needed ships that could take a beating. The Bechimo was exactly that. She was built to smash through ice. Her hull was reinforced with thick steel. For 9 years, she was the workhorse of the Arctic, sailing from Vancouver up to the northern coast of Canada, delivering supplies to remote outposts and picking up valuable furs. The crew of the Bechimo was led by Captain John Cornwell. Cornwell was not a man who scared easily. He was a veteran of the ice. He knew the waters, he knew the weather, and he respected the dangers of the North. In the summer of 1931, the Bechimo set off on what was supposed to be a routine run. They sailed north, threading their way through the treacherous waters, stopping at various trading posts. The trip was successful. The hold was full of furs worth millions of dollars in today's money. They turned the ship around and began the long journey home to Vancouver. But the Arctic in 1931 had other plans. Winter came early that year. And when winter comes to the Arctic, it does not knock on the door. It kicks the door down. By late September, the weather turned violent. The temperature plummeted. The sky turned a bruised purple and black, and the ocean began to solidify. On October 1st, the Bechimo was near the tiny settlement of Barrow, Alaska. This is the northernmost point of the United States. The water around the ship began to thicken into what sailors call Frazil ice, a slush that signals the ocean is freezing. Within hours, the slush turned into hardpack ice. The Bechimo, despite her reinforced hull and powerful steam engine, began to slow down. The ice was not just floating on the surface, it was squeezing the ship. Imagine a vice grip made of millions of tons of white concrete. Captain Cornwell pushed the engines to full power. The ship shuddered. The metal groaned. But the ice was too thick. The Bechimo ground to a halt. She was trapped. At first, the crew was not panicked. This happened in the Arctic. You get stuck, you wait for a shift in the wind, the ice opens up, and you move. They waited for 2 weeks, but the ice did not open. It got worse. The pressure against the hull became immense. The ship started to list or tilt to one side. The crew could hear the rivets popping. It sounded like gunshots ringing out through the steel hull. On October 15th, Captain Cornwell made a difficult decision. He realized that if the ice crushed the ship suddenly, his crew would be trapped inside and dragged to the bottom. He ordered the crew to abandon ship. They did not go far. They walked about a half-mile across the frozen ocean to the solid ice near the shore of Barrow. They built a makeshift shelter, a wooden hut, so they could keep an eye on the ship. Their plan was to wait out the winter, or at least wait until the ship was crushed so they could salvage the expensive furs. So, you have this surreal scene. 30-plus sailors, shivering in a wooden shack on the ice, watching their massive ship sitting helpless in the distance, stuck in the white grip of the frozen ocean. For weeks, they watched. The ship moved a little bit as the ice shifted, but she remained trapped. Then, on November 24th, 1931, the weather went from bad to apocalyptic. A blizzard struck the area. This was not a normal snowstorm. This was a whiteout hurricane. The wind screamed at over 60 miles per hour. The temperature dropped to minus 50 degrees. The visibility was zero. If you held your hand out in front of your face, you could not see your fingers. The crew in the hut huddled together, praying the roof would not blow off. For 3 days, the storm raged. They could not leave the hut. They could not see the ship. They could only listen to the wind howling like a banshee. Finally, the storm broke. The wind died down. The sun, which was barely rising at this time of year, cast a pale light over the frozen ocean. Captain Cornwell and his men stepped out of the hut. They looked toward the spot where the Bechimo had been stuck for over a month. The spot was empty. There was nothing there, just a jagged ridge of pressure ice. Captain Cornwell stared at the empty horizon. His heart sank. He assumed the obvious. The blizzard and the pressure of the shifting ice had finally crushed the hull, and the Bechimo had sunk to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, taking the fortune in furs with her. The crew was devastated, but they were also resigned. The sea takes what it wants. They packed up their meager belongings and prepared to be rescued by planes that were scheduled to fly them out now that the cargo was lost. But just a few days later, a local Inuit hunter arrived at their camp. He looked confused. He asked Captain Cornwell, "Why are you still here? Why aren't you on your ship?" Cornwell looked at him and said, "My ship sank. It's gone." The hunter shook his head. "No," he said. "It didn't sink. I just saw it. It is floating about 45 miles away to the south." Cornwell was stunned. 45 miles? How could a ship move 45 miles through solid ice in the middle of a blizzard without a crew? Cornwell gathered a few of his men, and they took dog sleds to the location the hunter had described. Sure enough, there she was, the SS Bechimo. She was sitting crookedly in the ice, looking like a ghost. She was covered in snow, rigging frozen, but she was very much afloat. Cornwell boarded the ship. He expected to find it leaking and ruined. But miraculously, the ship was intact. The hull had not been breached. However, Cornwell made a calculation. He looked at the damage to the rudder, he looked at the winter setting in, and he decided that the ship was not seaworthy enough to be sailed back to civilization. He figured it was only a matter of time before she actually sank. So, the crew frantically unloaded the most valuable furs, about half the cargo, and loaded them onto sleds. They worked until they were exhausted. Then, for the second time, Captain Cornwell abandoned the Bechimo. He left her to die. He assumed that within a week she would be at the bottom of the sea. Captain Cornwell was wrong. This was the moment the SS Bechimo ceased to be a normal ship and became a legend, because the Bechimo did not sink. Instead, she began a journey that would defy the laws of probability. Months passed. Spring arrived in 1932. A dog sledder was traveling near the coast of Herschel Island, hundreds of miles east of where the ship was abandoned. He looked out at the water, and he saw a strange shape drifting in the fog. He got closer. It was a massive, rusty steamship. It was drifting silently, aimlessly. There was no smoke coming from the stack, no lights on the deck. It was the Bechimo. She had survived the winter alone. This was just the beginning. Over the next few years, reports started flooding in from all over the Arctic. Inuit hunters, explorers, and traders would report seeing the ghost ship of the Arctic. Sometimes she was stuck in the ice, looking like a monument. Sometimes she was drifting freely in open water, moving against the current as if she were being steered by an invisible hand. In 1933, 2 years after she was abandoned, a group of indigenous Alaskans and some fur trappers spotted the ship drifting near the coast. It was a calm day. They decided to board her. They thought, hey, there is still cargo on this ship. There are supplies. There is valuable equipment. They paddled their small boats out to the steel giant. They climbed up the rusted ladder. The deck was eerie. It was perfectly silent. The only sound was the wind whistling through the cables. They went below deck. It was like a time capsule. There were plates on the tables in the mess hall. There were books in the captain's quarters. There were still bales of fur in the hold. But while they were inside exploring, the Arctic weather turned on them. A sudden, violent storm blew in out of nowhere. The wind picked up and the ice began to move. The trappers realized they could not get back to their small boats. The waves were too high, and the ice floes were smashing against the hull. They were trapped. For 10 days, these men were prisoners on the ghost ship. Imagine the terror. You are trapped on a derelict vessel that has been drifting for 2 years. You have no idea where it is going. You have no idea if the hull is about to snap in half. You are drifting blindly into the dark, freezing ocean. They survived by eating the canned food that had been left in the galley back in 1931. They slept in the crew's bunks, listening to the metal groan and shriek as the ice squeezed the ship. They must have wondered if the ghosts of the crew were watching them. Finally, after 10 agonizing days, the storm broke. The ship drifted close enough to a large ice floe that the men were able to jump off and walk back to land. They left empty-handed, terrified, and happy to be alive. The Beichimo drifted away again, as if she had just wanted company for a few days. You would think that eventually someone would salvage this ship. I mean, it is a 1,300-ton vessel worth a fortune. In 1939, 8 years after the abandonment, a daring captain named Hugh Poulsen spotted the Beichimo. Captain Poulsen was a man of action. He saw the ship and said, "I am going to bring her in." He maneuvered his own ship next to the ghost ship. He managed to get towing cables attached to her bow. This was it. The Beichimo was finally going to be captured. But the Beichimo seemed to have a will of its own. As soon as Poulsen began to tow her, the ice moved in. It was almost targeted. Massive blocks of jagged ice began to slam into Poulsen's ship. The tow lines pulled tight, threatening to capsize his vessel. The ice was closing in so fast that Poulsen realized he had a choice. He could cut the Beichimo loose, or he could go down with her. With a heavy heart, Poulsen ordered his crew to take axes and chop the tow lines. The cables snapped with a sound like a whip crack. The Beichimo drifted free, disappearing into the white mist. It was almost as if the ship was mocking him. She refused to be owned. She refused to be saved. The years rolled on. 1940, 1945, 1950. The world changed. World War II happened. Man invented the atomic bomb, jets started flying in the sky, and through it all, the SS Beichimo kept sailing. She became a part of the landscape. Pilots flying over the Arctic would look down and see her, a rusty brown speck in a world of white. She was seen off the coast of Alaska. She was seen in the Beaufort Sea. She was seen near the Chukchi Sea. She covered thousands of miles, zigzagging back and forth, defying every prediction of naval architects who said she should have sunk decades ago. How was this possible? How can a steel ship survive the crushing power of the Arctic ice for that long without maintenance? Theories abound. Some say she was just lucky, always finding the path of least resistance. Others say she was light in the water because the heavy cargo had been removed, allowing her to ride up on top of the ice rather than being crushed by it. And of course, the locals began to whisper that the ship was cursed or possessed, steered by the spirits of the North who wanted to keep her as a trophy. The final confirmed sighting of the SS Beichimo happened in 1969. Think about that. 1969. That is the year humans walked on the moon. That is 38 years after she was abandoned. A group of Inuit hunters in the Beaufort Sea saw the ship. She was frozen in a large pack of ice, looking more like a part of the iceberg than a ship. She was rusted, battered, and beaten, but she was still upright. She was still there. After 1969, she vanished. No one has seen her since. In 2006, the Alaskan government launched a project to find the ghost ship of the Arctic. They used sonar, they checked satellite imagery, and they scoured the ocean floor in the areas where she was last seen. They wanted to solve the mystery once and for all. They found nothing. No wreckage. No hull. No debris field. So, where is the Beichimo? Logic dictates that she finally succumbed to the sea. Maybe in a massive storm in the early 1970s, she finally took on too much water and slipped beneath the waves. She is likely resting on the muddy bottom of the Arctic Ocean, a rusted skeleton in the dark. But there are those who believe she is still out there. The Arctic is a vast, vast place. There are thousands of miles of uninhabited coastline. There are fjords and bays that no human eyes see for years at a time. It is technically possible, however unlikely, that the Beichimo is still floating. or perhaps grounded on some lonely, frozen beach that isn't on any map, waiting for the ice to melt so she can sail again. The story of the Bechimo is a reminder that we do not conquer nature, we just borrow space from it. Captain Cornwell thought he could sail the Arctic, and the Arctic took his ship and turned it into a ghost. For 38 years, that ship sailed alone. She weathered storms that would sink modern vessels. She navigated ice fields that would crush submarines. She did it without a human hand on the wheel. And if you are ever on a boat in the freezing waters north of Alaska and the fog rolls in thick and heavy and you see a dark shape drifting silently toward you, do not assume it is just an iceberg. It might be the Bechimo, still refusing to die, still looking for a crew to take her home. Today's story is about a mistake so small, so simple, and yet so catastrophic that it haunts the history of the Alaskan wilderness to this day. It is a story about how a single gesture, a movement of the hand that took less than 3 seconds, sealed a man's fate in one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. To understand the gravity of this tragedy, we first have to look at the setting. We are going to the Brooks Range in Alaska. This is not the Alaska of cruise ships and tourist gift shops. This is the deep bush. It is a place of jagged, snow-capped peaks, endless valleys of tundra, and rivers that freeze so solid you can drive a truck over them. It is a place where the sun refuses to set in the summer and refuses to rise in the winter. It is a landscape that is indifferent to human life. It does not care if you are hungry, it does not care if you are cold, and it certainly does not care if you made a clerical error. In 1981, a man named Carl McCunn decided he was going to conquer this landscape not with a gun, but with a camera. Carl McCunn was 35 years old. He was a wildlife photographer, but he was also a bit of a drifter, a rock and roll fan, and a guy who everyone seemed to like. He had long, shaggy hair, a thick beard, and an easygoing smile. He was originally from West Germany, but had grown up in San Antonio, Texas, before finding his way to the Pacific Northwest and eventually Alaska. He worked odd jobs on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, making good money, but his real passion was photography. Carl had a dream. He wanted to do what the great nature photographers did. He wanted to immerse himself in the wild, alone, for months on end, to capture the raw beauty of the Alaskan wilderness without the interference of civilization. He wanted to photograph the caribou migrations, the wolves, the bears, and the changing of the seasons. So, in late 1980, he began planning his magnum opus. He would spend 5 months from March to August camped alone at a remote, unnamed lake in the Brooks Range, about 75 miles northeast of a tiny settlement called Fort Yukon. Carl was not a total novice. He had spent time in the woods before. He knew how to handle a rifle. He knew how to set up a camp. But Carl had a fatal flaw. He was a dreamer. And sometimes dreamers overlook the boring, gritty details of reality. In March of 1981, Carl hired a bush pilot to fly him out to this remote lake. The plane was a small, single-engine aircraft on skis, capable of landing on the frozen surface of the lake. They loaded up the plane. Carl brought an immense amount of gear. He had 500 rolls of film, he had 2 rifles and a shotgun for protection and hunting. He had hundreds of pounds of beans, rice, and dried meat. He had photography equipment worth thousands of dollars. As the plane hummed over the white, frozen expanse of the Brooks Range, Carl must have felt the thrill of adventure. He was leaving the noise of the world behind. The pilot landed the plane on the ice. The engine idled, the propeller spinning against the cold air. They unloaded the boxes. Carl McCunn stood there in his parka, breathing in the frigid air, looking at the spot that would be his home for the next 5 months. And this is where the mystery begins. This is where the first domino fell. The pilot, a man who had flown many people into the bush, asked Carl a standard question. When do you want me to come back and pick you up? Now, in the world of bush flying, this is the most important conversation you will ever have. You set a date. You set a time. You set a backup date in case of bad weather. You write it down. You pay a deposit. But Carl was casual. He told the pilot, I am not sure yet. I might stay a bit longer. I might leave early. I will figure it out. The conversation was loose, vague. Carl McCunn was under the impression that he could just signal a plane when he was ready, or that this pilot would check on him at the end of the season. The pilot, on the other hand, left with the understanding that Carl McCunn had not yet hired him for a return trip, and that Carl would likely find another way back, perhaps with friends who were coming to visit, or another charter service. The pilot got back in his plane, taxied across the ice, and took off. Carl watched the plane disappear into the white sky. The sound of the engine faded away, leaving behind a silence so deep and heavy it felt like a physical weight. Carl was now completely alone. For the first few months, everything went according to plan. It was a photographer's paradise. As spring melted into summer, the ice on the lake broke up. The tundra exploded with wildflowers. The days grew longer until the sun was circling the sky 24 hours a day. Carl spent his days hiking and taking incredible photos. He chronicled his life in a diary. His entries from this time are filled with wonder. He wrote about tracking a pack of wolves. He wrote about the majesty of the grizzly bears that roamed the valley. He cooked his beans, he read his books, and he felt like he was living the dream. He was the king of his own private kingdom. But as July turned into August, the reality of the Alaskan calendar began to set in. In the Brooks Range, summer is a fleeting, beautiful lie. By mid-August, the air starts to get crisp. The leaves on the dwarf willows turn gold and then blood red. The sun starts to dip below the horizon again. The birds begin to fly south. Carl McCunn realized it was time to go home. His provisions were starting to run low. He had eaten most of his good food. He was down to the basics. And, more importantly, he was ready to develop those 500 rolls of film and show the world what he had seen. He began to wait for a plane. Every time he heard a distant hum, he would scramble out of his tent, scanning the sky. But the hum would usually fade away, just a high-altitude commercial jet flying 30,000 feet above, completely unaware of the man standing down there. August passed. The nights started getting cold. Frost began to cover his tent in the mornings. The lake water grew dark and slushy, preparing to freeze again. Carl began to worry. He realized, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that he had never actually confirmed a pickup date. He had assumed the pilot would remember him. He had assumed that someone would come looking. He wrote in his diary, "I think I should have used more foresight about arranging my departure. I will soon find out." And then it happened. The moment that defines this entire story. It was late August or early September. The exact date is a bit fuzzy, but the event is crystal clear. Carl was at his campsite when he heard it. The distinct, low roar of a single-engine aircraft. And it was not high up, it was low. He burst out of his tent. He grabbed his orange sleeping bag cover to use as a flag. He ran to the edge of the lake. There, in the sky, was a plane. It was a small bush plane, the kind used by Alaska State Troopers or local hunters. The pilot had spotted the camp. The plane banked sharply and began to circle the lake. Carl McCunn's heart must have been hammering in his chest. This was it. Salvation. He was going home. The plane flew low over him. The pilot was looking down. Carl was overcome with relief and excitement. He stood there in the middle of the vast wilderness, and he raised his right arm. He waved his hand high in the air, pumping his fist, waving the orange cloth, shouting for joy. The plane circled once. Then it circled twice. Carl watched, a huge grin on his face, waiting for the plane to lower its flaps and descend for a landing on the water or the rough shoreline. But the plane did not land. Instead, the pilot leveled the wings. The engine roared as the pilot added power. And then the plane turned away. Carl stood there, his arms still raised, frozen in confusion. He watched as the plane got smaller and smaller. He watched until it was just a speck. He listened until the silence returned. Why did they leave? Why did they not land? It was not until later, when Carl went back to his tent and rummaged through his supplies, that he found a small hunting regulation booklet he had brought with him. On the back of one of the pages, there was a diagram. It was a chart of emergency hand signals used by air rescue teams. He looked at the chart, and his blood ran cold. The chart showed two different signals. One signal meant, "I need help. I am in distress. Pick me up." To make this signal, you were supposed to raise both arms above your head, forming the shape of the letter Y for "Yes, I need help." The other signal meant, "I am okay. All is well. Do not wait." To make this signal, you raise one arm in the air. Carl McCunn, in his excitement to greet the pilot, had raised one arm. To the pilot looking down from above, he saw a man standing by a well-organized camp, looking healthy, waving one arm casually. The pilot interpreted this as a friendly traveler, saying, "Hello, I am fine. Great day for a flight." The pilot had actually dipped his wings, a signal meaning message received, and flown away, thinking he had just checked on a happy camper who wanted to be left alone. Carl McCunn had waved goodbye to his only chance of survival. The psychological blow of this realization was devastating. But Carl was a tough guy. He tried to stay positive. He wrote in his diary about his stupidity, but he also wrote that surely someone else would come. But no one else came. September hit like a hammer. The snow started to fall. The lake froze over completely. Now, Carl was in a fight for his life, but he was fighting a losing battle. He was out of food. He had spent months hiking and burning calories, and now he had no fuel to put back in his body. He tried to hunt, but the animals had migrated or gone into hibernation. The caribou were gone. The bears were sleeping. He managed to shoot a few ducks and muskrats, but it was not enough. He started digging into the snow to find dried rose hips, tiny berries that offered almost no nutritional value. His body began to consume itself. This is what happens during starvation. First, the body burns fat. Carl lost all his body fat. Then, the body begins to eat the muscles. Carl became weak. Walking became a chore. Gathering firewood became a marathon event. The temperature plummeted to 20 degrees below zero, then 30 below, then 40 below. His tent, which was designed for three-season camping, was not built for an Arctic winter. He had to keep a fire going constantly, but he was too weak to chop wood. He started burning his notebooks. He contemplated burning his film, the very reason he was out there, but he couldn't bring himself to destroy his work. By November, Carl McCunn was a skeleton. He was suffering from frostbite. His hands and feet were turning black. The pain was excruciating. His diary entries from this time are heartbreaking. They shift from the observations of a naturalist to the ramblings of a man staring into the abyss. He wrote about dreams of food. He wrote about steak, about chocolate, about his family in Texas. He hallucinated that he heard planes, but the sky was empty. He knew he was not going to make it. He calculated the calories he needed versus what he had, and the math simply did not work. In late November, the darkness was almost total. The sun barely crested the horizon. Carl made a decision. He was not going to let the cold take him slowly. He was not going to lie there and freeze to death in agony while his mind unraveled. He sat down and wrote his final entry. It was a letter to his father and his friends. He asked them to forgive him for his carelessness. He gave instructions on how to develop his film. He wanted his photos to be seen. He wanted his life to have meant something. He wrote, "I have used my last bullet." This was not entirely true, as investigators would later find out, but it was a poetic way to say he had made his choice. Sometime in late November or early December of 1981, Carl McCunn lay down in his sleeping bag. He was wrapped in every piece of clothing he owned. He was emaciated, weighing perhaps half of what he weighed when he arrived. He took his rifle, he positioned it, and he pulled the trigger. The silence returned to the valley. The snow continued to fall, burying the tent, burying the man, and burying the camera gear that held the images of a beautiful, deadly summer. Months passed. The winter raged on. It was not until February 2nd, 1982, that an Alaska state trooper piloted a plane over the area. He noticed a tent half buried in the snow. It looked abandoned, but something felt wrong. Usually, trappers or hunters would have packed up by now. The trooper landed the plane on the frozen lake. He strapped on his snowshoes and hiked up to the campsite. The scene was eerie. It was perfectly silent. The wind whistled through the bare trees. The trooper approached the tent. He called out, "Hello? Anyone home?" There was no answer. The trooper unzipped the frozen door of the tent. Inside, he found the frozen body of Carl McCunn. He was incredibly thin, his face gaunt. Next to him was his diary, and right near the body was his driver's license. Carl had taken it out and placed it clearly in view so that whoever found him would know exactly who he was without having to search his pockets. It was a final act of consideration from a man who had been known for his kindness. But the most haunting thing found at the campsite was a small note, scrawled on a piece of paper. It read, "Dear God in heaven, please forgive me my weakness and my sins. Please look over my family." And then, a second note, perhaps the most tragic of all, "They flew right over me. I waved, they waved back, and then they left." The story of Carl McCunn became a legend in Alaska, a cautionary tale told to every greenhorn and newcomer who steps off a plane in Fairbanks or Anchorage. The photos he took were eventually developed. They were stunning. They showed the breathtaking beauty of the Brooks Range, the jagged mountains, the wildflowers, the herds of caribou moving like a river across the land. They showed a man who was deeply in love with the world. But looking at those photos now, it is hard not to see the ghost in the frame. It is hard not to think about the man behind the camera, the man who had everything he needed to survive, except for a calendar and a clear understanding of a hand signal. It is a reminder that in the wild, the line between life and death is razor thin. It is not always a bear attack or a fall from a cliff that kills you. Sometimes it is just a misunderstanding. Sometimes it is just a wave of the hand. Carl McCunn wanted to be one with nature. In the end, nature claimed him completely. He became part of the frozen landscape he loved so much, leaving behind only a tent, 500 rolls of film, and a story that makes you wonder. If you were standing there, alone in the silence, watching that plane fly away, what would you have done? So, the next time you are out in the woods, or even just hiking a local trail, remember Carl. Make a plan. Tell someone where you are going. And if you ever see a plane and you need help, remember to use two hands, because one hand might just be a wave goodbye. Today's story is about a journey that was supposed to be a victory lap, but turned into a slow-motion nightmare. It is a story about the finest police officers in the world, men who were considered unbreakable, being slowly taken apart by the unforgiving silence of the Canadian North. It is a reminder that in the wild, confidence can be just as deadly as a bullet. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Now, let's get into the story. To understand the magnitude of this tragedy, we first have to look at the man at the center of it. His name was Inspector Francis Fitzgerald. In 1910, Francis Fitzgerald was a legend in the Royal Northwest Mounted Police. He was the kind of guy other cops wanted to be. He was handsome, he was tough, and he had spent his entire career in the Arctic. He had sailed the worst seas, arrested the most dangerous criminals, and traveled thousands of miles by dog sled. He was known as the man who never failed. Because of his stellar reputation, Fitzgerald was chosen for a prestigious assignment. Every winter, the Mounted Police did a patrol, a mail run from Fort McPherson, which is way up in the Northwest Territories, to Dawson City in the Yukon. This was not a walk in the park. It was a 475-mile trek through some of the most rugged, mountainous terrain on Earth. But for a man like Fitzgerald, it was routine. In fact, Fitzgerald didn't just want to do the patrol. He wanted to destroy the record. He wanted to make the trip faster than anyone had ever done it before. He selected his team carefully. He picked 3 men. First, there was Constable Richard Taylor. He was a powerhouse, a veteran woodsman who was fit and strong. Then there was Constable George Kinney. He was not as tough as Taylor, but he was reliable. Finally, there was Special Constable Sam Carter. Carter was an expert herdsman and a longtime resident of the North. So, You have four tough, experienced men. They had the best dogs. They had the best equipment. They were the dream team of the Arctic. But right before they left, there was a red flag, a massive red flag. A local indigenous guide offered to go with them. The route from Fort McPherson to Dawson City is tricky. There are hundreds of rivers and creeks that all look exactly the same. If you take one wrong turn, you end up in a dead end. Fitzgerald looked at the guide and shook his head. He said, "No thanks. I have a map, I have a compass, and I have Sam Carter. He knows the way." Fitzgerald was so confident in his ability to move fast that he made a critical calculation. He decided to travel light. He packed enough food for 30 days. The trip usually took roughly 30 to 40 days. He was cutting it razor thin because he assumed they would be flying across the snow. On December 21st, 1910, the four men and their three teams of 15 dogs set off from Fort McPherson. The temperature was a brisk 21 degrees below zero. The villagers waved goodbye, watching the lost patrol disappear into the white horizon. They expected to hear news of their record-breaking arrival in Dawson City in a few weeks. For the first week, everything went according to plan. The team was making incredible time. They were covering 20 miles a day. They laughed, they joked, and they camped under the northern lights. Fitzgerald felt validated. He didn't need a guide. He was the master of the North. But on New Year's Day, 1911, the luck ran out. A massive snowstorm hit. The trail, which was usually visible, was buried under feet of fresh powder. The landmarks were erased. Fitzgerald began to rely heavily on Sam Carter to navigate. But there was a problem. Sam Carter had only done this route once before, and it was 5 years ago, and he had done it in the opposite direction. The terrain started to look unfamiliar. They were searching for a specific river called the Little Wind River. It was the key to crossing the mountain range. Sam Carter looked at a frozen creek and said, "This is it. This is the turn." Fitzgerald checked his map. It didn't look quite right, but he trusted his man. He trusted the experience. So the patrol turned right, heading up a steep, winding canyon. They traveled for days up this river. The going got harder. The snow got deeper. The dogs were struggling. Finally, after wasting nearly a week fighting their way up this canyon, the river just ended. It fizzled out into a dense forest of willow and jagged rocks. It was a dead end. They had taken the wrong turn. Fitzgerald stood there, looking at the dead end, and the weight of his mistake crashed down on him. They had wasted precious food and precious energy going the wrong way. He checked the supplies. They had enough food left for maybe a week or two, but they were only halfway to Dawson City. Fitzgerald made the only decision he could. He said, "We have to turn back. We have to go back to Fort McPherson." It was January 12th, 1911. The return trip should have been easy. Just follow their own tracks back, right? Wrong. The wind in the Arctic is relentless. Their tracks from the journey up the canyon had been completely blown away. They were breaking a fresh trail all over again. And now, the temperature dropped. We are talking about 50 degrees below zero. At that temperature, the air hurts to breathe. Your eyelashes freeze together, and they were running out of food. This is where the story shifts from an adventure to a horror movie. By mid-January, the dog food was gone. The dogs, which had been their loyal engines, were now starving. They became weak. And in the Arctic, when a sled dog can no longer pull, it becomes something else. It becomes food. Fitzgerald ordered the first dog to be killed. The men sat around the campfire, cooking the meat of the animal that had pulled them for hundreds of miles. It was a grim meal. Dog meat is tough, stringy, and has very little fat. In the cold, your body needs fat to burn for heat. Lean meat doesn't cut it. You can eat a full belly of lean meat and still starve to death. It is called rabbit starvation. As they trudged back toward Fort McPherson, the men began to deteriorate. Their faces grew gaunt. Their movements became slow and jerky. Constable Taylor and Special Constable Carter were hit the hardest. They started to hallucinate. They complained of pains in their feet. Frostbite was setting in. Their toes were turning black. By the end of January, they were still hundreds of miles from safety. They were now killing a dog every few days just to stay alive. But there is a dark science to eating sled dogs. The liver of a dog, especially one that has been working hard in the Arctic, can be toxic to humans. It contains dangerous levels of vitamin A. But the men were so hungry, so desperate for anything that tasted like food, that they ate the livers too. This likely made them sick, causing their skin to peel and their heads to throb, adding to the misery. On February 5th, the group reached a breaking point. They were back at the river where they had made the wrong turn. But they were broken men. Taylor and Carter could barely walk. They were stumbling, falling, and crying out in pain. Fitzgerald looked at his team. He knew that if they stayed together, they would all die. Taylor and Carter were moving too slow. So, Fitzgerald made a desperate gamble. He decided to leave the two sick men behind with a small amount of equipment and camp. He and Constable Kinney, who was still somewhat mobile, would make a mad dash for Fort McPherson. They would run, get help, and send a rescue team back for the others. It was a noble plan, but it was a doomed plan. Fitzgerald and Kinney left their friends. They took the strongest remaining dogs and started running. But running is a strong word. They were shuffling. They were skeletons in parkas. A few days after they split up, Fitzgerald and Kinney realized they weren't going to make it. They were too weak. The snow was too deep. And then something truly heartbreaking happened. They realized that Taylor and Carter, the men they had left behind, had not stayed in camp. In a delirium of fear and madness, the two sick men had tried to follow them. Fitzgerald and Kinney stopped. They waited. Eventually, the two groups merged again. But now, nobody had any strength left. The dogs were all gone. They had eaten every single one. They were boiling the leather harnesses and the rawhide straps of their snowshoes to drink the broth, just to get the taste of something organic in their mouths. On February 12, 1911, the diary of Inspector Fitzgerald goes silent. Back at Fort McPherson, the weeks had ticked by. People were getting worried. The lost patrol should have been back, or a message should have arrived from Dawson City saying they made it. But the telegraph line was silent. A corporal named William Dempster, a man who respected Fitzgerald but knew the dangers of the land, decided to launch a rescue mission. He gathered a team of indigenous trackers and set out to find the lost legends. Dempster moved fast. He followed the trail. He found the abandoned campsites, and at each campsite, he found evidence of the horror. He found dog paws severed and left in the snow. He found harnesses cut up and chewed on. On March 21st, 1911, 3 months after the patrol had left, Corporal Dempster was traveling down the Peel River, just about 25 miles from Fort McPherson. 25 miles. That is one long day of hiking. They were so close. Dempster saw something in the distance. It was a blue handkerchief tied to a tree branch, fluttering in the wind. He approached it slowly. Beneath the tree, buried under a layer of fresh snow, were two shapes. Dempster brushed the snow away. It was Constable Taylor and Special Constable Carter. They were lying side by side. They were emaciated beyond recognition. Their faces were skeletal. Carter's hands were folded over his chest. Taylor had evidently died first, and Carter, in his final moments, had tried to cover his friend with a sleeping bag before lying down to die himself. But where were Fitzgerald and Kinney? Dempster and his team continued searching. They found tracks leading away from the bodies. Fitzgerald and Kinney had tried one last, desperate push. They had left their dead friends to try and crawl the last 25 miles. About 10 miles further down the river, Dempster found a makeshift campsite. There was a kettle sitting on the remains of a fire that had burned out weeks ago. Inside the kettle was half-cooked piece of moose skin, part of their boots. And lying next to the fire were the bodies of Inspector Francis Fitzgerald and Constable George Kinney. Fitzgerald was lying on his back. Even in death, he looked like he was trying to maintain some dignity. But the scene was horrific. He weighed less than 100 pounds. Dempster searched Fitzgerald's pockets. He found a piece of charcoal and a piece of paper. On it, Fitzgerald had written his last will and testament. It was a message to his wife. The note was shaky, written by a hand that was freezing to death. It read, "All money, watch, map, and furs is left to my beloved wife, Leela, and daughter. God bless you." And then, underneath that, a final line that summed up the entire tragedy. A confession from the man who never failed, the man who thought he could beat the North. He wrote, "My last hope is gone." The discovery of the lost patrol shocked the world. It was front-page news in London, New York, and Ottawa. How could the best of the best die like this? An inquiry was held. They analyzed every decision Fitzgerald made. They concluded that it was a combination of bad luck, bad weather, and one fatal flaw: hubris. Fitzgerald wanted the speed record so badly that he refused a guide. He wanted to travel so light that he didn't bring enough food for an emergency. He trusted his own legend more than he trusted the reality of the landscape. When the bodies were examined, it was determined that they had died of starvation and exposure. But the psychological torture they endured, the realization that they had taken a wrong turn, the eating of the dogs, the slow march toward a home they would never see is unimaginable. They were buried in Fort McPherson. Their graves are still there today, 4 white picket fences in a row, marking the resting place of the lost patrol. The Royal Northwest Mounted Police changed their rules after this. They made it mandatory to hire indigenous guides for long patrols. They established food caches along the route so that no one would ever starve again. But the lesson of Inspector Fitzgerald remains. The Arctic is a place of absolute truth. It does not care about your rank. It does not care about your past victories. It does not care if you are a hero. If you take a wrong turn and you are not prepared, the wind will bury you just the same. So, the next time you are planning a trip and you think you don't need a map because you have a good sense of direction, just remember the lost patrol. Remember the blue handkerchief tied to a tree just 20 miles from safety. And remember that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is admit that you need help. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. I hope you're having a strange, dark, and mysterious day, because today we are diving into a cold case that has baffled law enforcement for decades. A perfect, clean disappearance where the evidence contradicts itself, leaving behind a profound and unnerving mystery. This is a story about how a person can vanish completely, leaving behind only their perfectly preserved and utterly normal life. This is the story of They Found the Car, but Never the Driver. Before we dive into the deep end of the mysterious, do me a favor. If you enjoy this type of content, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and let me know in the comments what city you are watching this video from. Your support helps me keep telling these strange, dark, and mysterious stories. Our story begins in the vast, desolate landscape of the American Great Basin, specifically in the state of Nevada in the summer of 1994. This is a region of long, empty highways and expansive desert where the nearest sign of civilization might be 50 miles away. Our central figure is a man named Peter Graham. Peter was a 35-year-old software engineer from Sacramento, California. He was a creature of habit, known for his punctuality and meticulous organization. In July of 1994, Peter took a week off work, telling his family he was driving to Salt Lake City, Utah for a solo hiking trip in the mountains. He left his home on a Friday morning, driving his brand new metallic blue Ford Explorer. He was expected to call his wife, Carol, that Sunday evening upon checking into his hotel in Salt Lake City. Sunday came and went. Carol did not receive a call. Monday morning, Peter did not check in to his office. By Tuesday, Carol filed a missing person report. Peter Graham had vanished without a trace between Sacramento and Salt Lake City. The police immediately launched an investigation, focusing on the most logical assumption: a car accident on one of the treacherous mountain passes of the Sierra Nevada. For 3 agonizing weeks, the search turned up nothing. Peter's blue Ford Explorer, which should have been highly visible, was nowhere to be found. The police began to suspect foul play, a robbery, or perhaps Peter had abandoned his life, though those close to him dismissed this idea immediately. Then, nearly a month after Peter disappeared, a state trooper patrolling a remote, unpaved service road 50 miles north of Tonopah, Nevada, a road Peter had absolutely no logical reason to be on, spotted something out of place. It was the blue Ford Explorer. The car was parked deep off the main road, resting perfectly level on a stretch of flat, packed earth. It was not hidden. It was simply placed, facing west, toward the setting sun. The police swarmed the location. The first thing they noted was the sheer anomaly of the scene. The car was pristine. There was no crash damage, no dents, and no mud. It was simply parked, as if waiting for its owner to return from a brief errand. The official report, written by the lead detective, described the interior of the Explorer in minute, chilling detail. The interior of the Ford Explorer. The keys. The ignition was off, and the keys were not in the car. They were found resting neatly on the center console, exactly where one might place them before getting out. The personal effects. Peter's wallet, containing $400 in cash and all his identification, was on the passenger seat. His expensive wristwatch was on the dashboard. His laptop, still inside its carrying case, was on the back seat. Nothing of value had been stolen. The windows and doors. All 4 windows were rolled up tightly. The doors were unlocked. There were no signs of a struggle, forced entry, or resistance. The food. A half-eaten sandwich, wrapped in aluminum foil, was resting on the driver's side floor mat beside a nearly full can of soda. The food was slightly spoiled by the desert heat, suggesting it had been left within the first few days of the disappearance. The gas tank. The fuel gauge read nearly full. Peter had only driven a fraction of the distance from his last known gas stop. The car was a perfect snapshot of an ordinary moment suddenly interrupted. Peter Graham had stopped his car, turned off the engine, placed his keys and belongings neatly inside, taken a bite of his lunch, and then stepped out. And then he had vanished. The search teams, dozens of volunteers, dogs, and aerial reconnaissance scoured the surrounding desert. They searched for signs of a struggle, footprints, or discarded clothing. They found nothing. The ground was hard, rocky, and unforgiving, but experienced trackers confirmed one terrifying detail. There were only one set of footprints leaving the driver's side door. Peter had gotten out of the car, taken perhaps 5 or 6 steps toward the west, and then the prints simply stopped. It was as if the ground had opened up and swallowed him whole. The police were baffled. If this were foul play, why leave the keys and the cash? If it were an animal attack, where were the signs of struggle or blood? If Peter had hiked away to harm himself, why leave his fully stocked backpack in the vehicle? The missing details. As the investigation intensified, the focus shifted to the objects that were not in the car. The police confirmed that Peter had packed a large, durable hiking backpack containing water, a compass, and emergency supplies. The backpack was missing. This indicated that Peter had planned to walk away, but only for a short time, as he had left his wallet and keys behind. However, the most unsettling missing detail was found in the car's trunk. Peter's hobby was photography. He always traveled with his high-end, heavy-duty SLR camera. The camera was not in the car, nor was the special rolling tripod he always used. When Carol was shown the list of contents, she revealed an additional, horrifying detail. Peter had loaded a brand new roll of 36 exposure film into his camera the night before he left. This film was now missing. The detective theorized. Peter had parked, had lunch, grabbed his backpack and his camera, and walked a short distance into the desert to take a photo. But what would compel a meticulous man to leave his entire identity and his means of travel behind just for a picture? The police searched the entire area for the camera or the tripod. They even tried to find signs of a camera bag, believing the tripod might have been used to secure a camera for a long exposure. Nothing was found. The case went cold, quickly devolving into urban legend. Peter Graham was presumed dead, but his manner of disappearance was considered the perfect, impossible crime. The phone call. The story takes a chilling turn 3 years later, in 1997. Carol Graham had moved to a new state and was trying to piece her life back together. She had changed her phone number and was living under a cloud of grief and unanswered questions. One afternoon, her phone rang. It was an unknown number, and the voice on the other end was distorted, faint, and riddled with static, as if speaking from a very long distance. "Hello?" Carol asked. The voice crackled back. "Carol?" It was Peter. It wasn't just a similar voice. It was Peter's unmistakable cadence, the slight, distinctive tremor in his speech. Carol, paralyzed by shock, could only whisper his name. "Peter? Oh my God, Peter, where are you?" Peter's voice came back, thin and desperate, fighting through the static. "Carol, I don't know where I am. I took the picture. I took the picture of the thing. I shouldn't have." "What thing, Peter?" "The police found your car. Where are you? The air is wrong here. It smells like ozone and dry ice." Carol, I'm trying to develop the film. I have to see the photo. His voice was rising to a frantic pitch. The tripod. I put the tripod on the structure, Carol. It wasn't a mountain. It was too sharp. It was geometric. Carol was sobbing now. Please, just tell me where you are. I can find you. I'm close. I can see the lights. I can see the blue car, Peter whispered, his voice suddenly dropping to a horrifyingly clear tone. Carol, I think I'm standing next to the car, but the air is black here. The sun isn't working. He was describing his location, precisely the place where the car was found, but he was clearly experiencing the reality glitch that defined Peter's story. The final words Carol heard, before the line went dead, were choked with terror. The structure. It's dissolving the film. It's dissolving me. Carol, look at the picture. Look at what I took. The line went silent. The call was untraceable, originating from a single low-power cell signal that flickered once near the original desert location and then vanished forever. The police revisited the site, checking for any new physical evidence, including any sign of a geometric structure, but the desert floor was undisturbed. The mystery of Peter Graham remains one of the most frustrating disappearances on record. The evidence suggests two terrifying possibilities. He stepped out of reality, that the location where he parked was a brief, localized anomaly, a tear in the dimensional fabric. Peter stepped out of his car, carrying his camera to photograph something impossible, and that object or event simply erased him from this reality. The stopping of his footprints is the moment he passed through the barrier. The car is a beacon, that the perfectly preserved car, with all his valuables, wasn't abandoned. It was left as a deliberate, static marker. Peter's final phone call suggests he was still connected to that location, perhaps standing next to the car, trapped in a mirrored dimension where his world was dark, and his only link was the final roll of film documenting the impossible structure he stood on. The blue Ford Explorer was eventually sold at auction, but the desert road where it was found is now avoided by locals. They claim that if you drive down that road late in the afternoon, sometimes you can see a strange, rhythmic flashing light in the distance, the brief, powerful flash of an old SLR camera, taking a picture of the setting sun, desperately trying to capture the last image of the world it used to know. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the strange, dark, and mysterious story of the time they found the car, but never the driver. Until next time, take care of yourselves. How is everyone doing today? I hope you are all well, and if you are not, I hope things get better for you soon. Welcome back to the channel. I've got a true story for you today. It is strange, it is dark, and it is mysterious. And it details the terrifying events that occurred in one of the most remote, utterly isolated ghost towns in North America, Kennecott, Alaska, a town frozen in time, haunted not just by history, but by the powerful, vengeful curse of the copper mine itself. Before we get into the story, I want to ask you a quick question. Where in the world are you watching this video from right now? Go down into the comment section and let me know. I always enjoy seeing how far the strange, dark, and mysterious family extends. Now, let's get into the story. Our narrative takes us back to the far northern frontier of Alaska, high up in the Wrangell Street Elias National Park, to a ghost town named Kennecott. Kennecott was once a booming, thriving mining camp built almost entirely around a massive copper deposit discovered in the early 1900s. It was an industrial marvel, accessible only by a single winding railroad track deep in a wilderness defined by immense glaciers and towering, impossibly cold mountains. The town was abandoned abruptly in 1938 when the copper ran out. The company packed up its operations, but rather than removing the buildings, they simply locked the doors and walked away. The result is a perfectly preserved, silent industrial town of colossal wooden structures, mill buildings, and processing facilities, all left at the mercy of the brutal Alaskan winters. The entire place is a frozen monument to greed and haste. Our story focuses on a team of 3 civilian engineers and 1 historian hired by the National Park Service in the early 1990s. Their mission was straightforward: assess the structural integrity of the massive mill building, the largest wooden structure in Alaska, before the Park Service could begin preservation efforts. They were essentially historians of decay. The team consisted of Dr. Aaron Wells, the lead engineer, and an expert in cold weather physics. Ben and Lisa, 2 structural technicians, and Dr. Ellen Gray, the historian, who was obsessed with the strange, short, and wildly profitable history of the Kennecott mine. The team arrived in late October. The last bush plane dropped them off, promising to return in exactly 2 weeks. They were equipped with satellite phones, generators, and enough high-tech monitoring gear to stabilize a small skyscraper. The atmosphere in Kennecott was immediately unsettling. The town felt utterly, profoundly silent. The immense wooden mill building, 12 stories high, built into the side of the glacier, loomed over them like a massive sleeping beast. Everything was covered in a deep layer of dust and ice. Dr. Gray, the historian, quickly uncovered the source of the town's strange, dark, and mysterious energy. She found old, local rumors that suggested the Kennecott copper deposit was not a natural occurrence. The local Athabascan tribes had long warned against mining that specific mountain, claiming it was the heart of the sleeping stone, and that the rich copper veins were the frozen metal blood of a powerful, ancient mountain spirit. Taking the copper, they warned, would result in a terrible, slow, and specific curse upon the thieves. Dr. Wells, the engineer, dismissed this as folklore. He was focused on the mill building. As they began their structural analysis, they discovered something physically impossible. The massive wooden beams and supporting trusses that made up the enormous structure were not simply cold. They registered an internal temperature several degrees lower than the external air temperature. The wood was actively, aggressively cold, acting as a massive heat sink, drawing energy out of the air. "It's thermodynamic nonsense," Wells muttered, checking his sensors. "The wood is radiating cold. It's colder than the ice it's built into." Over the next few days, the team began to feel the effects of this impossible cold. Their high-tech generators constantly stalled. Their batteries drained at an unnatural rate. The temperature inside their own heated cabin remained stubbornly frigid. Then, the phenomena became more focused and terrifying. Ben, the structural technician, was working alone on the 7th floor of the mill, installing a stress monitor onto a massive beam. He was wearing thick gloves and a heavy parka. Suddenly, he heard a sound, not a human sound, but the sound of heavy, dry, rhythmic metal grinding, as if the huge, silent, ore-crushing machinery deep in the mill's basement had inexplicably roared to life. Ben froze, listening. The sound was followed by a sharp, clear voice, not from the radio, but originating from the hollow wooden walls right next to him. The voice was deep, resonant, and spoke in perfect, clear English, yet it sounded like gravel being scraped against steel. The voice said simply, "Thief, return the blood." Ben threw his tools and scrambled down the 12 flights of stairs in a blind panic. When he reached the bottom, he found the other members of the team, who had heard nothing but Ben's screams echoing in the vast empty structure. Wells, the lead engineer, still insisted on a logical explanation: resonant frequencies, structural settling, wind noise, but he couldn't explain the voice. Dr. Gray, however, knew. She had found a specific reference in the old mine logs. The local Athabascan legend warned that the curse of the heart of the sleeping stone was not aimed at their lives, but at their warmth and their tools. The spirit would not kill them directly, but would slowly, methodically, freeze their very purpose, their machines, their power, and their will until they succumbed to the mountain's cold. The most bizarre, dark, and mysterious event occurred the next night. The team was huddled in their cabin, afraid to leave. They heard the sound of footsteps outside. Not human footsteps, but a slow, heavy, rhythmic, dragging sound moving across the hard-packed ice right outside their windows. It sounded like something with immense, massive feet was slowly circling their cabin. Mike, the engineer, grabbed the high-powered thermal camera and looked out the window, pointing the lens into the darkness. What the camera showed defied everything Dr. Wells believed about physics. There was a figure outside the cabin, a colossal silhouette about 10 feet tall. But the creature was not hot or cold. It was perfectly, absolutely null. It registered 0 Kelvin, a terrifying, impossible temperature that showed up on the thermal camera as a blank, perfectly black void against the warm purple background of the snow. It was a zone of pure, absolute cold moving in the physical world. The creature was dragging something. The thermal camera captured the sight of a large, heavy, antique copper kettle being dragged across the ice. The kettle was radiating a fierce, localized heat, the only warm spot in the entire scene, glowing white-hot against the creature's cold blackness. As the creature stopped right outside their door, the voice, the grinding, gravelly voice, spoke again, inside their heads this time. "The warmth is mine. It leaves with the blood." The team understood the horrifying symbolism. The copper was the blood of the mountain. and the creature, the vengeful spirit, was collecting the copper and the heat energy it represented, storing it in the copper kettle before taking it back to the frozen core of the mill. Dr. Wells, abandoning all pretense of scientific objectivity, realized the only way to survive was to somehow break the curse's focus. They had 1 day left before the bush plane was due. They had to survive until morning. Wells developed a desperate plan. They had to return the source of the heat back to the mill, confusing the spirit's focus. The primary heat source in the cabin was their generator. They managed to haul the heavy, sputtering generator out onto the snow and dragged it toward the colossal mill building. The air grew impossibly cold as they neared the mill, the internal cold of the wood now actively attacking them. Their eyelids felt glued shut, and their lungs burned. As they approached the massive mill entrance, the sound of the metallic grinding began again, growing deafening. They saw the creature. It was standing at the threshold of the mill, its null-black form outlined by the dim moonlight. The copper kettle was sitting at its feet, radiating intense, pure heat. Wells, on the verge of collapse, pushed the sputtering generator over the threshold. The generator roared, spewing heat and exhaust into the cold air. The moment the generator's heat hit the ground, the creature reacted. It let out a single, piercing, non-acoustic shriek of pure, telepathic pain that knocked the team backward onto the ice. The mill building then reacted. The massive wooden structure, 12 stories of silent, dead timber, began to groan not from settling, but from immense internal effort. The internal temperature sensors, which they were still carrying, spiked violently, showing a sudden, catastrophic internal heat surge that should have instantly incinerated the building. The colossal structure was fighting itself, the generator's heat against the mountain's cold. The creature's null-black form dissolved instantly into a cloud of swirling, white, supercooled vapor. The copper kettle, now empty, rolled across the ice and shattered into 1,000 shards of brittle, frozen metal. When the snow settled, the mill was silent again. The internal heat surge vanished, returning the mill to its impossible cold. The generator was now silent, completely seized and frozen solid. The team staggered back to the cabin, barely alive. The next morning, the bush plane arrived. The pilots found the team severely frostbitten, nearly incoherent, but alive. The pilots reported an anomaly. The massive wooden mill building, which had stood perfectly preserved for decades, was now covered in thousands of tiny, microscopic fractures that were all concentrated around the massive support beams. The wood had been violently stressed, as if the mill had been momentarily twisted from the inside out. The team was evacuated. They all suffered permanent nerve damage from the cold exposure, and they all carried one permanent auditory injury, a continuous, faint internal tinnitus that sounded exactly like the low, rhythmic grinding of the silent copper mill. The official report blamed hypothermia and a localized mechanical failure for the team's distress. Dr. Wells, however, never practiced engineering again. He dedicated his life to researching the strange, dark, and mysterious relationship between geometry and heat. His final unpublished theory stated that the curse of Kennecott was the mountain's method of reversing entropy, actively cooling and freezing the remnants of the human endeavor, ensuring the mountain's time would never pass. The final dark postscript to the story. Dr. Ellen Gray, the historian, years later, was monitoring the National Park Service's live stream from a camera placed high on the mountain overlooking the abandoned mill. The camera was running silently. One night, the camera captured something impossible. The enormous copper mill building, 12 stories of decaying wood, did not move. But the massive shadow it cast onto the glacier below suddenly and violently stretched and retracted, as if the mill were breathing a massive, silent, living heart, still sucking the heat from the world around it, waiting for the next brave souls to challenge the curse of the frozen copper mine. And that is where our story ends, with the terrifying knowledge that sometimes the true curse is not death, but the eternal, impossible, profound cold. If you enjoyed this strange, dark, and mysterious story, please consider hitting that like button, and if you are new here, hit that subscribe button to join our community. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you all on the next one. Today's story is about one of the most baffling disappearances in North American history. It is a case that sparked the largest search and rescue operation ever conducted in the Great Smoky Mountains, involving the FBI, the Green Berets, and thousands of volunteers. Yet, To this day, it remains unsolved. This is the story of Dennis Martin. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. To understand how truly terrifying this story is, you first have to understand the setting. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park, straddling the border between North Carolina and Tennessee, is a place of ancient, breathtaking beauty. It is named for the natural fog that hangs over the range and looks like large smoke plumes. It is a dense, temperate rainforest with over 800 square miles of wilderness. It is a place where families go to make memories, to camp, and to escape the noise of the city. But the locals know something else about these mountains. They know that the terrain is unforgiving. The vegetation is so thick, often called rhododendron hells, that a person can step 5 feet off the trail and completely disappear from view. It is in this vast green ocean of trees that the Martin family arrived for a Father's Day weekend trip. It was June 14th, 1969. Bill Martin, a successful architect from Knoxville, Tennessee, had been looking forward to this trip all year. It was an annual tradition for the Martin family. Every Father's Day, the men of the Martin family, Bill, his father Clyde, and his 2 sons, would hike into the mountains to camp. This year, they were headed to a place called Spencefield. Spencefield is a grassy bald, a high-altitude meadow sitting along the Appalachian Trail. It offers stunning views and wide-open spaces, making it a perfect spot for camping. Bill brought along his 2 sons. There was his older son, Douglas, and his younger son, Dennis. Dennis Martin was just 6 years old. He was a cute kid, a little small for his age, with a mop of dark hair and an adventurous spirit. On this particular trip, Dennis was wearing a very distinct outfit. He had on a bright red t-shirt, green shorts, and white socks with little Oxford-style shoes. That red shirt is a crucial detail because in the deep greens and browns of the forest, red is the one color that should stand out like a beacon. It is the color of safety, or at least it should have been. The hike up to Spencefield was grueling but uneventful. The family arrived at the clearing, set up their campsite, and began to enjoy the pristine mountain air. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the atmosphere was relaxed. There were other families up there too. In fact, another family, the Martins' friends, were camped nearby with their own 2 young sons. So, you had a group of 4 young boys running around the meadow, playing tag, and burning off energy while the fathers sat on the grass, chatting and keeping a casual eye on them. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the grass, the boys decided they wanted to play a prank on the adults. You know how kids are. They love the thrill of the jump scare. The plan was simple. The adults were sitting in a loose circle talking. The 4 boys would split up, sneak around the perimeter of the clearing, hide in the bushes, and then, on a silent signal, they would all jump out at once and scream to startle their dads. Because Dennis was the youngest, and because he was wearing that bright red shirt, the older boys told him he needed to hide separately so he would not give away their position. The 3 older boys went one way, creeping to the left. Dennis, eager to play his part perfectly, went the other way. He trotted off alone toward a patch of dense brush on the edge of the forest. Bill Martin watched his son go. He saw the flash of the bright red shirt as Dennis ducked behind a large bush. Bill smiled, knowing exactly what the kids were up to. He leaned back, ready to play along, ready to act surprised when the boys jumped out. He watched the bush where Dennis was hiding. He was only about 20 or 30 feet away. It was close. Close enough to throw a baseball. Close enough to hear a twig snap. A few minutes passed. The tension built in that playful way children love. Then, the signal was given. Boom. From the left side of the clearing, the 3 older boys burst out of the bushes, screaming and laughing. The fathers jumped, feigning shock, laughing along with the kids. It was a chaotic, happy moment of family fun. But Bill Martin was not looking at the 3 boys. He was looking to his right. He was looking at the bush where Dennis had hidden. He was waiting for his 6-year-old to jump out and join the fun. But Dennis did not jump out. The laughter of the other boys died down. They looked around, breathless and smiling. "Where's Dennis?" one of them asked. Bill stood up. He felt a tiny prick of annoyance, thinking maybe Dennis had misunderstood the plan or was just being shy. "Dennis?" he called out. "Okay, buddy, you got us. You can come out now." There was no answer, just the sound of the wind moving through the tall grass of Spence Field. Bill walked over to the bush. He expected to see his son crouch down, giggling, hand over his mouth. Bill reached out and pulled the branches aside. There was nothing there. The space behind the bush was empty. At that specific moment, panic did not set in fully. Not yet. The human brain tries to rationalize things. Bill assumed Dennis had just moved to a better hiding spot. Maybe he had crawled a little further back into the woods to be even sneakier. "Dennis!" Bill yelled louder. "Come on out!" Bill stepped past the bush and entered the tree line. He walked 10 yards, then 20 yards. He scanned the woods. The trees were dense here, the undergrowth thick with rhododendrons and mountain laurel. "Dennis!" Silence. Bill turned back to the other adults. The look on his face had changed. The other fathers saw it immediately, that sudden, sharp transition from relaxation to alertness. They all stood up. "He's not there," Bill said, his voice rising in pitch. For the next 10 to 15 minutes, the men frantically searched the immediate area. They ran in widening circles, calling Dennis's name. They checked the nearby trails. They checked the steep drop-offs. But there was no sign of him. No flash of a red shirt. No sound of a crying child. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed him whole in the span of 3 minutes. Bill Martin, realizing this was serious, ran miles down the trail to the ranger station to get help. By 8 in the evening, the National Park Service had been alerted. Rangers began to converge on Spence Field, but then the situation went from bad to catastrophic. As night fell over the Great Smoky Mountains, the weather turned. Dark, heavy clouds rolled in, blocking out the moon and stars. The temperature plummeted, and then the sky broke open. A massive thunderstorm struck the mountain range. It was not just a little rain, it was a deluge. In a matter of hours, nearly 3 inches of rain fell. Thunder shook the ground, and lightning flashed, illuminating the terrified faces of the searchers. This storm was the worst possible thing that could have happened. For one, it meant that a 6-year-old boy, wearing only a t-shirt and shorts, was out there alone in the freezing, wet dark. Hypothermia would set in rapidly, but from an investigative standpoint, the storm was a disaster. The torrential rain washed away everything. If there were footprints, they were turned to mud. If there was a scent trail for tracking dogs to follow, it was obliterated. The rain scrubbed the mountain clean of clues. When the sun rose the next morning, the reality of the situation set in. Dennis Martin was gone, and the clock was ticking. What followed was the largest search effort in the history of the National Park Service. News of the missing boy spread across the country. It touched a nerve. Everyone could imagine the horror of a child lost in the woods. Volunteers flooded into the park. We are talking about Boy Scout troops, college students, firemen, police officers, and local hunters. At the peak of the search, there were over 1,400 people scouring the mountainside. The search was massive, but it was also chaotic. In 1969, search and rescue protocols were not as refined as they are today. The massive influx of well-meaning volunteers actually created a problem. Thousands of people trampling through the woods destroyed any potential physical evidence that the rain had missed. They left their own footprints, dropped their own trash, and created so much noise that if Dennis had been crying out for help, no one would have heard him over the shouting of the searchers. Desperate to find the boy, the request went all the way to the White House. President Richard Nixon was briefed on the situation. In an unprecedented move, the federal government sent in the Green Berets, the special forces of the United States Army. 64 highly trained Green Berets were deployed to the Smokies. These were men trained to track enemies in the jungles of Vietnam. If anyone could find a 6-year-old boy in the woods, it was them. They set up a grid search. They moved shoulder to shoulder, crawling through the brush, checking every hollow log, every cave, every crevice. Helicopters with thermal sensors, which were primitive at the time but still high tech for the era, flew overhead. Bloodhounds were brought in. Days turned into a week. A week turned into two. Despite the Green Berets, the helicopters, the bloodhounds, and the thousands of volunteers, they found absolutely nothing. No scrap of red cloth, no shoe, no body. However, there were strange clues. Clues that have fueled mysteries and conspiracy theories for over 50 years. The first clue was a set of footprints found near a stream miles away from Spence Field. The tracks were small, the right size for a 6-year-old. But here is the strange part. One footprint was from an Oxford shoe, like Dennis was wearing. The other footprint was barefoot. Why would he take off one shoe? And why were the tracks leading into such rugged, dangerous territory, far away from where he disappeared? The searchers followed the direction of the tracks until they vanished into the brush, but they led to nowhere. The second clue, or rather, the second lead, is the most disturbing part of this entire story. It is the detail that keeps people awake at night. Several miles away from Spence Field, around the same time Dennis went missing, a tourist named Harold Key was hiking with his family near an area called Sea Creek. This area is very remote, rugged, and difficult to access. Harold Key and his family heard something terrifying. They heard a scream. It was an enormous, sickening scream. Harold Key described it later as a scream that definitely came from a child, a scream of pure terror. Harold stopped and scanned the ridge above him to see where the noise came from. He saw movement. Through the trees, he saw a figure, but it was not a child. Harold Key told investigators that he saw a wild man. He described a disheveled, rough-looking man moving quickly through the trees. The man appeared to be hiding, moving with a strange, stealthy gait. But the most chilling detail was that this man appeared to be carrying something on his shoulder. Harold Key could not make out exactly what the bundle was, but he saw something red. Remember, Dennis Martin was wearing a bright red shirt. Harold Key thought the man looked suspicious enough that he reported it to the park rangers and the FBI. He told them about the scream, the rough-looking man, and the red object. Now, you would think this would be the breakthrough. You would think the FBI would swarm that ridge, hunting for this wild man. But that is not what happened. The FBI and the Park Service authorities determined that the sighting was too far away from Spence Field to be relevant. They calculated the distance and the ruggedness of the terrain and decided that a 6-year-old boy could not have traveled that far in the time between his disappearance and when Harold Key heard the scream. They concluded that there was no way the two events were connected. They dismissed the lead. Years later, however, expert trackers and hikers have disputed this dismissal. They argue that if Dennis had been abducted, if someone had grabbed him the moment he stepped behind that bush, the kidnapper could have moved quickly. Or perhaps Dennis, fueled by the adrenaline of panic, had run much faster and further than anyone estimated. But the authorities kept the Harold Key sighting quiet for a long time. It was not until much later, through Freedom of Information Act requests and leaked documents, that the public learned the full extent of this sighting. There is another layer to the wild man theory. The Great Smoky Mountains have a long history of folklore involving feral humans, or mountain men who live completely off the grid, deep in the woods, detached from civilization. While most people dismiss these as campfire stories, there have been actual documented cases of fugitives and hermits living in those mountains for years without being detected. Did Dennis Martin stumble upon one of these individuals? Was he snatched by a predator who used the chaos of the mountains to hide? The search for Dennis Martin was eventually scaled back and then finally called off. It remains the most extensive and expensive search in the park's history. The Green Berets packed up and left. The volunteers went home. The Martin family was left with a hole in their hearts that would never heal. Bill Martin spent the rest of his life looking for his son. He spent his fortune, his energy, and his sanity trying to find answers. He never gave up hope that perhaps Dennis was still alive somewhere, or that at least his remains would be found so he could give him a proper burial. But the mountain never gave Dennis back. There is a tragic footnote to this story. Years later, overwhelmed by the grief and the lack of closure, and possibly suffering from other life struggles, Bill Martin passed away. Some say he died of a broken heart. The mystery of what happened on that grassy hill in 1969 destroyed not just one life, but an entire family. To this day, if you hike the Appalachian Trail near Spence Field, it is a beautiful, serene place. The views are just as spectacular as they were in 1969. But if you know the story, the silence of the woods feels a little heavier there. You look at the dense rhododendron thickets, the hells, and you wonder, how does a boy vanish in 60 seconds? Did he get lost and succumb to the elements, his small body hidden in a crevice that searchers missed by inches? Was he taken by a mountain lion? Though no blood or torn clothing was ever found. Or was there something darker roaming the woods that day? A wild man who saw a flash of a red shirt and seized an opportunity? We will likely never know the truth. The disappearance of Dennis Martin remains one of the most unsettling mysteries of the national park system. It is a reminder that no matter how safe we feel, the wilderness is vast, indifferent, and full of secrets. And that is where the story ends. But the question remains, what really happened to Dennis Martin? If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, this case is the ultimate example of why you should always keep your loved ones close when you step into the wild. Because sometimes, all it takes is a single moment, a single turn around a bush for someone to be gone forever. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. I hope you're having a strange, dark, and mysterious day, because today we are venturing into the wild, untamed vertical landscape of the Pacific Northwest. This is a story about the primal power of nature, the crushing isolation of the high peaks, and a mystery that involves two highly experienced climbers who reached the summit only to have the mountain itself devour them whole. This is the story of the night the mountain ate them. Before we dive into the deep end of the mysterious, do me a favor. If you enjoy this type of content, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and let me know in the comments what city you are watching this video from. Your support helps me keep telling these strange, dark, and mysterious stories. Our story centers on Mount Rainier, the colossal, glacier-covered stratovolcano that dominates the skyline of Washington state. Rainier is magnificent, but it is also one of the deadliest peaks in the world, responsible for hundreds of climbing fatalities. The event we are focusing on took place in the late summer of 1998. Our protagonists are two men, Ethan Cole and Marcus Bell. They were not tourists, they were seasoned professionals. Ethan was a veteran mountain guide with dozens of successful ascents of Rainier. Marcus was a highly skilled search and rescue technician. They were both physically impeccable and technically brilliant. They decided to attempt a difficult, rarely used route on the mountain's eastern face, a punishing, technical climb known for its deep crevasses and volatile weather. They planned a 4-day expedition, fully stocked with emergency supplies, satellite phones, and specialized mountaineering gear. Their objective was not just the summit, but to test a new geological sensor for the National Park Service. They departed on a Thursday morning, leaving their itinerary and coordinates with the park's ranger station. For the first 3 days, the climb went perfectly. The weather was clear, the ice was solid, and the men were making excellent time. Their scheduled check-ins with the ranger station were routine and cheerful. On Sunday morning, the 4th day, the weather changed dramatically. A sudden, unexpected storm rolled in, a ferocious whiteout blizzard that dropped visibility to 0 and sent temperatures plummeting. The last satellite phone call came in at exactly 10:05 a.m. Ethan's voice was strained, but calm. Ranger Base, this is Cole. We've reached the summit. We are logging the sensor data now. The storm hit fast. Visibility is 0. Winds are 60 knots. We are establishing the emergency summit anchor and beginning descent immediately. We'll check in at Camp Muir in 8 hours. Copy that, Cole, the ranger responded. Be safe. Get off that mountain. That was the last time anyone spoke to Ethan Cole or Marcus Bell. 8 hours passed. No check-in at Camp Muir. 12 hours passed. No call. 24 hours passed. The storm raged relentlessly. On Monday morning, when the storm finally broke, revealing a clear, brutal blue sky, the largest search and rescue operation in the history of Mount Rainier was launched. Dozens of teams, helicopters, and specialized radar equipment scoured the summit area. The conditions were perfect for spotting anything. The snow was fresh and the visibility was unlimited. The search teams expected to find one of two things: the men's emergency anchor and their bodies encased in ice, or a debris field indicating a fall down the face. They found neither. After 3 agonizing days of searching, the team found the evidence, and it was the most baffling result imaginable. They located the summit anchor, a heavy, steel climbing stake planted exactly where Ethan had reported, just 50 feet below the true summit cornice. The anchor was secure, and the rope attached to it had been meticulously cut, not broken, suggesting the men had finished their task and started their descent. Following the rope track, they found the men's packs. The 2 large, brightly colored climbing backpacks were discovered neatly stacked, resting on a flat slab of rock near the edge of a small crevasse. The packs were full, containing food, extra clothing, and emergency beacons. Everything was there. But the men were gone. The most chilling discovery was made inside the packs. Attached to the harness of Ethan's pack was a waterproof nylon pouch. Inside, they found the last remaining piece of evidence: the digital camera used to record their climb, along with the prototype geological sensor. The sensor data was logged perfectly, recording the precise moment they reached the summit. The digital camera contained only 7 photographs. The first 6 were perfectly normal shots of the ascent, showing happy, confident men against stunning vistas. The final photograph was taken from the summit, 10 minutes after the final call to the base. It was a picture of the storm. The image was a swirling, opaque wall of white snow and wind, illuminated only by the camera flash. It captured the terrifying ferocity of the whiteout. But in the bottom left corner of the frame, there was a faint, blurry shape, a dark, irregular outline against the white snow. It was too indistinct to identify, but it looked unnaturally sharp, almost geometric. The men had been standing right there, packs stacked, rope anchored, camera in hand, and they had simply vanished. The subsequent investigation ruled out every rational explanation. Avalanche. There was no sign of an avalanche chute or debris nearby. Crevasse fall. The closest crevasse was shallow, and there was no damage to the lip of the crevasse or the snow surrounding it. Hypothermia. Exposure. The men had abandoned their full packs, which contained the gear that would have saved their lives. They would never willingly discard their emergency insulation and food in a whiteout. Foul play. Impossible. They were alone on the summit. The only physical evidence remaining was the faint, dark shape in the final photo, and a single, unexplainable finding from the geological sensor. The data from the prototype sensor showed that at the exact moment the final photograph was taken, the ground beneath their feet registered an impossible reading. A sudden, massive spike in low-frequency seismic activity, not caused by an earthquake, but by something vibrating with immense power, a deep, resonant thrum that lasted only 3 seconds. The initial theory was that the men had encountered some kind of deep, hidden vent or gas pocket, and the sudden release of volatile gases caused them to lose consciousness and wander away. But this was quickly dismissed as scientifically unsound. The mountain ranger who had taken the final call, a man named Deputy Miller, was particularly haunted by the disappearance. He couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain hadn't merely killed them, it had consumed them. Years later, Deputy Miller was on patrol in the same region, dealing with an unrelated hiker accident when he was forced to spend the night in a rudimentary emergency shelter located a few thousand feet below the summit. It was a cold, clear night, and the mountain was utterly silent. Miller was drifting off to sleep when he heard a sound, a soft, metallic clink coming from directly outside the shelter. It sounded exactly like the small carabiner of a climbing rope hitting a rock. Miller immediately went outside, his flashlight raised. The snow was undisturbed. But as he scanned the steep rock face, the beam of his flashlight caught something clinging to the ice, about 50 feet up. It was a small object, frozen into the ice of the mountain. Miller spent an hour carefully climbing up to the spot. He chipped the object free and brought it down to the shelter. It was an old, tarnished silver locket. It didn't belong to either of the missing climbers, but it was undoubtedly a personal, sentimental item. As Miller held the locket, he saw that it was scratched and warped, as if it had been subjected to immense pressure. He managed to pry it open. Inside were 2 tiny, faded photographs, one of a young woman and one of a small child. And etched into the silver of the locket's interior, barely visible, was a series of tiny, repeating symbols, the complex fractal pattern that had also been seen on the object dug up in Siberia, and the one engraved on the monolith in the Challenger Deep. As soon as Miller touched the symbols, he heard the sound again, not the clink of the carabiner, but the deep, low, tectonic thrum that the men's sensor had recorded on the summit. The sound was not external, it was vibrating in the core of the locket. Deputy Miller immediately realized the chilling implication. The mountain itself was not just rock and ice, it was a shell, and the tremor was the sound of something immense and ancient shifting beneath the surface. The men, at the moment of their success, had stood on a temporary gateway, and the mountain had simply pulled them inside, taking their locket as a payment or a token. Miller returned the next day with a team, but the patch of ice where he had found the locket was gone, replaced by fresh snow. He never revealed the existence of the locket or the terrifying vibration. He knew the mountain had simply given him a warning, and he was wise enough to heed it. To this day, the case of Ethan Cole and Marcus Bell remains officially classified as disappearance in extreme conditions. But the climbers who frequent the eastern face of Mount Rainier know the truth. They speak of certain nights on the summit when the stars are too bright and the ground feels strangely hollow. And sometimes, when they anchor their ropes into the ice, they can hear a faint metallic clink far beneath them, a sound that suggests the mountain is not empty inside, but is waiting, holding something or someone for all of time. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the strange, dark, and mysterious story of the night the mountain ate them. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Today's story is a locked room mystery. But the locked room isn't a bedroom or a basement. The locked room is the entire continent of Antarctica. It is a story about a man who died in the most isolated community on Earth, surrounded by 49 other people who were his friends and colleagues. But when the autopsy was finally performed, it revealed that one of those 49 people, or perhaps the man himself, had done something deadly. And to this day, nobody knows exactly how it happened. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Now, let's get into the story. To understand the sheer terror of this situation, you first have to understand the setting. We are going to the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. This is a research facility run by the United States, sitting literally at the geographic South Pole. It is the most remote human habitation on the planet. In the summer, it is busy. Planes fly in and out, scientists come and go, but in February, the last plane leaves. And once that plane takes off, the winter-over crew is stuck. For the next 8 months, the temperature will drop to 100 degrees below zero. The sun will set and not rise again for 6 months. It is pitch black, freezing, and totally isolated. Even if you had a heart attack, or went crazy, or got murdered, no one is coming to help you. The year is 2000. The winter crew consisted of 50 people. These were scientists, engineers, and support staff. One of the most popular members of this crew was a 32-year-old astrophysicist named Rodney Marks. Rodney was brilliant. He was Australian, with a scruffy beard and a love for rock music. He wasn't your stereotypical quiet scientist. He was loud, he was funny, and he was the life of the party. He played bass guitar in the station's band, which they called Foucault's Pendulum. He liked to drink, he liked to tell jokes, and he was deeply in love. He was actually in a relationship with another scientist on the base, a woman named Sonia. Rodney was there to work on a very specific telescope called the ASTRO, or ASTRO. He was healthy. He had passed all the rigorous physical and psychological exams required to go to the South Pole. On May 11th, 2000, everything seemed normal. It was the middle of the Antarctic winter. Outside, it was dark, 24 hours a day. The wind was howling. Inside the station dome, it was warm and cozy. Rodney was walking from the astronomy building back to the main habitat. He started to feel weird. At first, he just felt a little nauseous. Maybe he had eaten something bad. Maybe he was coming down with the flu. But within a few hours, the nausea turned into violent vomiting. Rodney went to see the station doctor, a man named Robert Thompson. Now, Dr. Thompson was a good doctor, but you have to remember he was working in a glorified clinic. He didn't have an MRI machine. He didn't have a toxicology lab. He had basic supplies. Dr. Thompson examined Rodney. Rodney was anxious. He said he felt weak. He said his stomach was burning. But strangest of all, he said his eyes were bothering him. He was wearing sunglasses inside because the lights were hurting his eyes. Dr. Thompson checked his vitals. They were okay, but Rodney looked terrible. The doctor assumed it might be a gastric ulcer that had burst, or maybe a severe reaction to alcohol, although Rodney hadn't been drinking heavily that day. He gave Rodney an injection to settle his stomach and told him to rest. Rodney went back to his room. He tried to sleep, but the pain didn't stop. It got worse. Over the next 12 hours, Rodney Marks began to deteriorate rapidly. He was vomiting blood. His breathing became ragged and shallow. He was hyperventilating. His body was shutting down. Dr. Thompson was now very worried. He was consulting via satellite phone with specialists back in the United States, but describing symptoms over a scratchy phone line is not the same as being in a hospital. The doctors in America suggested it might be alcohol withdrawal, or a heart condition, or maybe an anxiety attack. They were all wrong. On May 12th, at around 6:30 p.m., Rodney Marks went into cardiac arrest. The doctor and the emergency team tried everything. They performed CPR for 45 minutes. They tried to shock his heart back into rhythm. But at 6:45 p.m. on May 12th, 2000, Rodney Marks was pronounced dead. Now, pause for a second and imagine the atmosphere in the station. There are 49 people left. They are locked in a bubble at the bottom of the world. It is pitch black outside. And their friend, the healthy, happy 32-year-old astrophysicist, just dropped dead for no apparent reason. Was it a virus? Was it something in the water? Was it contagious? Paranoia began to set in. But the horror was just beginning. Because planes cannot fly to the South Pole in the middle of winter, the fuel literally turns to jelly in the cold. They could not remove the body. The crew had to build a makeshift coffin out of wood scraps. They placed Rodney's body inside, and then they had to store him. They moved the coffin out into the cold storage area of the station, essentially burying him in the ice. For the next 6 months, the crew of the Amundsen Scott station had to live, work, and eat, knowing that their friend's frozen corpse was sitting just a few hundred feet away in the darkness. It was a long, brutal winter. The morale at the station plummeted. Rodney's girlfriend, Sonia, was devastated. The doctor was racked with guilt, wondering if he had missed something. Finally, October arrived. The sun rose. The temperatures warmed up enough to roughly 50 degrees below zero for a plane to land. A flight arrived to take Rodney Marks home. Because Rodney was an Australian citizen, his body wasn't flown to the United States. It was flown to Christchurch, New Zealand, which is the main hub for Antarctic operations. The autopsy was performed in New Zealand. Everyone expected the coroner to find a hidden heart defect or maybe a brain aneurysm, something natural. But when the toxicology report came back, the coroner dropped a bombshell. Rodney Marks did not die of natural causes. He had died from acute methanol poisoning. Now, for those who don't know, methanol is not the alcohol you drink. The alcohol in beer and wine is ethanol. Methanol is different. It is found in cleaning fluid, paint thinner, and scientific solvents. It is extremely toxic. If you drink even a small amount of methanol, your body metabolizes it into formic acid. This acid basically eats you from the inside out. It attacks your optic nerve first, which explains why Rodney was wearing sunglasses and complaining about his eyes, and then it shuts down your organs. The coroner found that Rodney had ingested about 150 milliliters of methanol, that is about a wineglass full. This changed everything. This was no longer a medical tragedy. This was a potential crime scene. There were only 3 possibilities. Possibility number 1. Suicide. Did Rodney drink the poison on purpose? The investigators looked into this, but it didn't make sense. Rodney had no history of depression. He was excelling in his career. He was in a happy relationship. He had just finished a phone call with his boss where he was excited about his work. And most importantly, methanol is a horrific way to die. It is slow and painful. A scientist like Rodney would know that. He left no note. The suicide theory was largely ruled out. Possibility number 2. Accidental ingestion. Did he drink it by mistake? People at the South Pole drink a lot of alcohol. It is part of the culture. Sometimes people brew their own moonshine or toast juice. Maybe Rodney thought he was drinking regular alcohol, but he drank a bottle of cleaner by mistake. This also seemed unlikely. Rodney was smart. Methanol smells different. It is usually kept in clearly marked containers in the lab. And here is the kicker. Nobody else got sick. If there was a bad batch of moonshine going around, half the station would have been vomiting. Only Rodney died. That left possibility number 3, foul play. Murder. Did someone at the station poison him? Suddenly, the police in New Zealand realized they had a massive problem. The death happened at a United States base. The victim was Australian. The body was in New Zealand, and the crime scene was in Antarctica, thousands of miles away. The jurisdiction was a nightmare. The New Zealand police wanted to investigate, but they had no authority to go to the American base. The Americans launched their own investigation, but by the time they started asking questions, months had passed since the death. The station had been cleaned. The trash had been thrown out. The specific bottle that the methanol might have come from was long gone. And the 49 witnesses? They had all scattered to different parts of the world as soon as the winter ended. The investigators did find a few strange clues. They found needle marks on Rodney's arm, but the doctor said those were likely from the attempts to draw blood or give him medication before he died. But were they? Could someone have injected him? They found that there was a supply of methanol in the scientific lab where Rodney worked. It was used for cleaning the telescope equipment. It was accessible. Anyone could have taken it. But who would want Rodney dead? He was popular. He was the guy everyone liked. There were no reports of major fights, no love triangles, no deaths. The New Zealand coroner held an inquest. He interviewed the crew members. Some people said Rodney was a heavy drinker, implying he might have been so drunk he grabbed the wrong bottle. But the autopsy showed his blood alcohol level was low when he died. He wasn't drunk. Other people whispered about tensions on the base. Living in isolation for 6 months makes people crazy. Small arguments turn into hatred. Had Rodney made a joke that offended the wrong person? The investigation hit a brick wall. The United States National Science Foundation, which runs the base, was accused of not cooperating fully. They released a statement saying they found no evidence of foul play, but they didn't release all their internal reports. In 2008, 8 years after the death, the New Zealand coroner released his final report. His conclusion was chilling. He stated that Rodney Marks died of methanol poisoning, but he could not determine how the methanol got into his body. He formally ruled that the intent was unknown. He stated, "I cannot rule out that he was given the methanol by another person, either as a prank that went wrong or with the intent to harm." Think about that. A prank that went wrong. Imagine someone spiking Rodney's drink with a little bit of lab alcohol just to make him sick or get him drunker, not realizing it was deadly methanol. And then watching him die and being too terrified to admit what they did. They would have had to live in that station with the body for 6 months, keeping that secret. Or someone wanted him dead, and they committed the perfect crime. They used a weapon that would vanish from the body eventually. They did it in a place where no police could arrive for 6 months. They did it in a jurisdiction black hole. To this day, the death of Rodney Marks remains the only unsolved death in the history of the South Pole. The 50 people who wintered over that year know the truth, or at least one of them does. Rodney's family in Australia has never stopped asking for answers. A memorial stone stands for him at the South Pole, facing the true geographic South. It reads, "Rodney Marks. He lived life to the fullest." But the question remains, did he lose his life to a tragic mistake? Or is there a murderer walking free today, a person who knows exactly what happened in the dark, frozen silence of the year 2000? So, if you ever find yourself working a winter contract in Antarctica and someone hands you a drink that smells a little bit like paint thinner, maybe just stick to the bottled water. How is everyone doing today? I hope you are all well, and if you are not, I hope things get better for you soon. Welcome back to the channel. I've got a true story for you today. It is strange, it is dark, and it is mysterious. and it details the horrifying events of a winter survival story that goes far beyond simple desperation, uncovering a terrible pact and a sequence of inexplicable phenomena that haunt one of the most infamous mountain passes in American history, Donner Summit. Before we get into the story, I want to ask you a quick question. Where in the world are you watching this video from right now? Go down into the comment section and let me know. I always enjoy seeing how far the strange, dark, and mysterious family extends. Now, let's get into the story. Our narrative begins in the early 1940s, long after the tragic, well-documented events of the original Donner Party, but in the exact same unforgiving, brutal location in the Sierra Nevada mountains. This area, known today simply as Donner Pass, remains remote, beautiful, and lethally dangerous during the winter months. Our protagonists are two men, Elias Vance and Walter Wally Quinn. They were not pioneers or travelers, but dedicated maintenance engineers hired by the newly formed State Transit Authority. Their job was crucial, to man a tiny, isolated observation shack near the summit of the pass. They were the Watchmen. 1. The Den, the sod of the best on round 1. Their purpose was to continuously monitor the towering snowpack and radio in warnings of potential avalanches or road-closing drifts to the small, scattered communities below. The Watch Shack was essentially a concrete bunker, a small, windowless, heavily fortified structure anchored directly into the granite, equipped with a shortwave radio, minimal supplies, and enough food for 2 men for exactly 3 weeks. The plan was simple. They would hike in, stay for 3 weeks, and then a relief team would hike in to swap them out. Elias, the older of the two, was a calm, meticulous man, known for his skepticism. Wally, the younger, was energetic, prone to tall tales, and deeply uneasy about the history of the pass, often speaking of the ghosts of the hungry. They were deposited at the shack in early December. The first 2 weeks passed uneventfully, filled with boring maintenance checks and shortwave radio chatter. Then, disaster struck in the form of the blizzard of 41. A sudden, unprecedented storm rolled in from the Pacific. It wasn't just a heavy snowfall, it was a meteorological event of pure, focused fury. The snow fell constantly for 6 full days, driven by winds that sounded, as Elias recorded in his log, like 1,000 angry voices screaming in the rock. The snow piled up instantly, burying the shack completely under a suffocating, dense white blanket. The relief team, scheduled to arrive on the 21st day, never made it. The roads were closed, and the blizzard made any attempt at a rescue impossible. Elias and Wally were alone, trapped, and running out of time. They had enough rations for perhaps 4 days of minimal subsistence eating, and then only the brutal silence of the snow. The 3rd week saw the strange, dark, and mysterious begin. The silence after the storm was terrifying. They were in total darkness, relying solely on the tiny light of a kerosene lamp and the constant, static-filled drone of the shortwave radio. The first strange event was the radio silence. On the 22nd day, the shortwave, which had been their only link to the outside world, suddenly went dead. Not just static, the set produced a complete, utter silence, even though the batteries were fully charged, and Elias checked the antenna and found no damage. They were now truly alone. The next day, the real terror began. Elias and Wally were sitting in the near darkness, conserving their last rations, when they both heard it, a sound of something scraping against the concrete ceiling directly above them. It was not the sound of wind or ice. It was a precise, rhythmic, heavy scrape, 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 as if something with immense weight and sharp claws was slowly dragging itself across the solid 6-inch thick roof of the bunker. Elias, the rational man, grabbed an iron pry bar. He checked the pressure gauge, which showed the snowpack above them was over 15 feet thick. No known animal could survive, much less move, through that density of snow and ice. The scraping continued for an hour, growing louder and more deliberate, seeming to circle the tiny bunker. Wally, pale and shaking, whispered, "It's the hunger, Elias. The hunger has found us." On the 25th day, with the food completely gone and the gnawing pain of starvation setting in, Wally made a proposal, a chilling pact born of desperation. "Elias," Wally rasped, his voice weak, "we are going to die. But we can choose how. The past takes what it is owed. We have a radio log, a place name, a record of our existence. we leave one record behind, a final message. We agree. The first one to lose the fight leaves a note for the other. Elias, too weak to argue, reluctantly agreed to the grim, unspoken terms. The final survivor would detail the last actions, ensuring the outside world knew their struggle. It was a pact of final dignity against the inevitable. On the 28th day, Elias lost the ability to stand. He was lying on the cot, his mind slipping into feverish confusion. Wally was barely moving, curled up on the floor. It was then that the sphere returned to full operation. The shortwave radio, which had been silent for 6 days, suddenly blared to life. Elias scrambled to the set, expecting to hear the military or the rescue team. But the radio was not broadcasting human voices. It was broadcasting a single, continuous sound of chewing. It was a wet, sickening sound of flesh and bone being slowly, deliberately torn and crushed. The volume was immense, the sound filling the tiny shack, echoing every starved thought in their heads. The sound was accompanied by a single, high-pitched, metallic whine that made the teeth ache. The sound persisted for exactly 10 minutes, then abruptly cut off, returning the radio to the previous heavy silence. Wally, now sitting up, his eyes wide and black, looked at Elias. "It's telling us what to do," he whispered, his voice dangerously even. "The past demands it. It's showing us the future." On the 30th day, Wally was gone. Elias woke from a fitful, feverish sleep to find Wally's cot empty. His heart hammered in his chest. He dragged himself across the floor, searching the tiny bunker. Wally was not there. The single, heavily reinforced door, the only way in or out of the bunker, was still sealed shut by the internal locking mechanism that only Elias could reach. The bunker was a tomb, and Wally had vanished from inside a sealed coffin. Elias was alone, surrounded by the silence of the radio and the crushing darkness of the snowpack. He found Wally's final note tucked under his pillow, written in a shaky, almost incomprehensible hand. The note didn't talk about the pact or the radio. It read simply, "The watchman must report. The summit needs its voice." Elias spent the next 2 days in a state of delirious starvation, convinced he was hallucinating the empty bunker, the radio silence, and the terrifying sound of chewing. Then, the final, inexplicable event occurred. The shortwave radio blared to life again. This time, it was not the chewing sound. It was the sound of a human voice, Elias's own voice, but faint, distant, and distorted by static. Elias listened, terrified, as his own voice broadcast a series of precise, detailed weather and snowpack readings, followed by the clear, calm sign-off he used every day. "This is Watchman Vance reporting clear conditions. End transmission." The voice then faded back to silence. Elias was sitting there, weak, starving, and unable to speak. Yet the radio was broadcasting a complete current weather report in his voice, reporting clear conditions from inside a sealed, snowbound tomb. Elias realized the terrifying truth. Wally had not escaped, and the past did not demand a victim. It demanded a watchman. Wally's disappearance, the sound of the chewing, and the inexplicable broadcast of Elias's voice were all part of a dark, persistent phenomena that used the isolated watchman to keep the past clear. Elias never escaped the bunker. He was found weeks later, severely emaciated, still clutching the shortwave radio, his eyes wide open, frozen in an expression of pure, final terror. He had died of starvation. Yet the final, horrifying analysis of his body showed that he had consumed something incredibly dense, non-nutritious, and fibrous, something the pathologists couldn't identify. And on the shortwave radio's log, the final entry, written in Elias's own hand on the day he died, was not a final goodbye, but a chilling message. "Conditions clear, visibility perfect, the summit is ready for travel." The most terrifying postscript to the story is that for the next 50 years, truckers, train engineers, and local residents who traveled the Donner Pass often reported hearing a faint, garbled voice cutting through their commercial radio bands, a voice giving outdated, nonsensical weather reports, and always signing off clearly. "This is Watchman Quinn reporting clear conditions." End transmission. The pass had taken its watchman, and in return for their ultimate sacrifice, it granted them eternal, starving servitude, binding their consciousness to the mountain itself to endlessly report the clear conditions that lure the next travelers into its ancient, hungry trap. And that is where our strange, dark, and mysterious story ends, with the chilling truth that sometimes the hunger of the mountain is not for flesh, but for silence. If you enjoyed this strange, dark, and mysterious story, please consider hitting that like button. And if you are new here, hit that subscribe button to join our community. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you all on the next one. Today's story is about a manhunt that sounds like it was written for a Hollywood action movie, but it is 100% true. It involves a man who possessed superhuman endurance, a man who could vanish into thin air, and a man who triggered the first ever aerial police chase in history. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Now, let's get into the story. To understand how impossible this story is, you first have to understand the environment. We are going to the far northern edge of Canada, to the Yukon and Northwest Territories border. The year is 1931. This is a place where the sun barely rises in the winter. The temperature routinely drops to 40, 50, sometimes 60 degrees below zero. It is a land of silence, snow, and death. If you make a mistake here, you do not just get hurt. You freeze solid. In July of 1931, a stranger arrived in the small settlement of Fort McPherson. He was a man of few words. In fact, he barely spoke at all. He was about 35 years old, with piercing blue eyes and a strong, stocky build. He told people his name was Albert Johnson. Now, in the North, people tend to be private. They do not ask too many questions. But Albert Johnson was different. He was not just private. He was hostile. He bought supplies, flour, sugar, a rifle, and ammunition, and then he floated down the Peel River on a makeshift raft. He eventually found a spot on the banks of the Rat River to build a cabin. But this was not a normal cabin. Most trappers build a simple shack to keep the wind out. Albert Johnson built a fortress. He cut down trees and built a small, squat cabin, roughly 8 feet by 10 feet. He sank the logs deep into the frozen ground. He cut shooting ports, small holes in the walls, so he could fire a gun in any direction without being seen. He built the door to be reinforced. It was as if he was preparing for a war. For the first few months, Johnson kept to himself. But in December of 1931, the local indigenous trappers began to notice something strange. Their traps were being triggered. Someone was springing them and hanging them in the trees. This is a huge violation of the unwritten code of the bush. You do not mess with another man's livelihood. The trappers complained to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, or the Mounties. On December 26, 1931, a police officer named Constable Alfred King and a special constable named Joe Bernard decided to pay Albert Johnson a visit. It was a routine check. They just wanted to tell him to knock it off. They trekked 60 miles through the snow to get to Johnson's cabin. When they arrived, they saw smoke curling from the chimney. Johnson was inside. Constable King walked up to the door and knocked. "Mr. Johnson?" he called out. "I am Constable King with the RCMP. I need to speak with you." Silence. King knocked again. "Mr. Johnson, open the door!" Inside the cabin, Johnson remained dead silent. But King could hear him moving. He could feel eyes watching him through one of those shooting ports. King looked at Bernard. This was weird. Usually, a lonely trapper is happy to see a friendly face. But Johnson gave them nothing. Without a warrant, the officers could not break in. So, frustrated, they turned around and made the 60-mile trek back to Fort McPherson to get a search warrant. 5 days later, King returned. This time, he brought 3 other officers with him. They had a warrant. They meant business. They approached the cabin. It was dead silent. The snow was piled high around the walls. Constable King walked up to the heavy wooden door. He shouted, "Johnson! Open up! We have a search warrant!" There was no answer. King stepped forward and put his hand on the door to push it open. Boom! A shot rang out from inside the cabin. The bullet punched through the wooden door and slammed into Constable King's chest. King was thrown backward into the snow, blood pouring from his wound. The other officers scrambled for cover behind the trees. They opened fire on the cabin, peppering the logs with bullets. But Johnson had built his fortress well. The bullets just thudded harmlessly into the thick timber. The officers were in a panic. Their friend was bleeding out in the snow, and they were pinned down by a maniac in a bunker. They managed to crawl out, grab King, and drag him to safety. They loaded King onto a dog sled and raced him back to civilization. It was a miracle, but King survived. Now, the gloves were off. You do not shoot a Mountie and get away with it. A posse was formed. It was led by Inspector Eames. He gathered 9 men, 42 dogs, and 20 pounds of dynamite. They were going to blast Albert Johnson out of his hole. On January 9th, 1932, the posse arrived at the cabin. It was 40 degrees below zero. A blizzard was raging. They surrounded the cabin. Inspector Eames shouted for Johnson to surrender. The only answer was a gunshot. The siege began. The police fired hundreds of rounds into the cabin. Johnson returned fire with deadly accuracy. He moved from one shooting port to another, keeping the 9 men at bay. Finally, Inspector Eames had enough. He ordered the dynamite to be brought forward. One of the officers crawled through the snow, lit a fuse on a 4-pound bundle of dynamite, and tossed it onto the roof of the cabin. The explosion was massive. It shattered the silence of the Arctic night. The roof of the cabin collapsed. One of the walls blew out. The cabin was reduced to a smoking pile of rubble. The officers stood up. They lowered their guns. There was no way anyone could have survived that. It was over. They began to walk toward the ruins to recover the body. Suddenly, from the smoking debris, a figure rose up. It was Albert Johnson. He had dug a foxhole inside the floor of his cabin and had hunkered down during the explosion. He popped up like a jack-in-the-box and opened fire. The officers dove into the snow. They could not believe it. This man was unkillable. The weather was getting worse. The officers were freezing. They were running low on food for the dogs. They realized they could not take him that night. So, incredibly, the posse retreated. They left Albert Johnson alone in the ruins of his fortress. When they returned a few days later, Johnson was gone. Thus began the most famous manhunt in Canadian history. Albert Johnson was on the run. But he was not running like a normal man. He was running like a machine. The conditions were horrific. It was now roughly 50 degrees below zero. Most men would die of exposure within hours without a fire and a tent. Johnson had no tent. He had no sleeping bag. He had very little food. And he was being chased by expert trackers and indigenous guides who knew the land better than anyone. But Johnson was always one step ahead. He used tricks that baffled the trackers. He would walk backward in his snowshoes for miles to make it look like he was going the other way. He would walk in the tracks of caribou herds to hide his footprints. At night, he did not build a fire because the smoke would give him away. So, how did he survive? How did he not freeze to death? He dug down into the snowbanks to create tiny insulated caves to sleep in. He ate whatever he could find. Some reports say he chewed on tree bark and raw small game he managed to snare on the run. This is where the legend of his toughness grew. He was consuming the land itself to keep going. The posse chased him for weeks. Every time they thought they had him cornered, he vanished. At one point, Johnson reached a barrier that the police thought would stop him. It was the Richardson Mountains. These are steep, jagged peaks that form a wall between the Yukon and the Northwest Territories. In the dead of winter, they are considered impassable. The police blocked the only 2 passes through the mountains. They sat there, waiting, thinking, "We have him trapped. He has to come through here." But Johnson did not use the passes. In the middle of a blizzard, in pitch-black darkness, Albert Johnson did the impossible. He climbed a 7,000-foot vertical cliff face of ice and rock. He did this without climbing gear, wearing heavy winter clothes, carrying a rifle and a backpack. When the trackers found his tracks at the top of the mountain a few days later, they were stunned. The indigenous guides looked at the cliff and said it was impossible. But the tracks were there. Johnson was superhuman, but the law was catching up. On January 30th, the posse caught up to him in a thick patch of forest. They spotted him. "Surrender, Johnson!" Johnson responded with his rifle. In the chaotic gunfight that followed, a brave young officer named Constable Edgar Millen was shot through the heart. He died instantly. Now, Johnson was a cop killer twice over, or at least he had killed one and wounded another. The Mounties were furious. They were not going to let this man escape. They realized that on foot they could not match him. Johnson was moving too fast. He was averaging nearly 30 miles a day in deep snow, so they called in a secret weapon. For the first time in the history of police work, they hired an airplane to help in a manhunt. They called in a legendary bush pilot named Wilfred Whop May. Whop May arrived in his Blanca monoplane. He flew over the frozen wilderness looking for tracks. From the air, Johnson could not hide his trail as easily. Whop May could spot the line of footprints leading through the snow and radio the position to the ground team. Johnson heard the plane. He tried to use the tactic of backtracking, walking in circles, confusing the trail. But the plane was relentless. On February 17th, 1932, the end finally came. The plane spotted Johnson walking down the middle of the frozen Eagle River. The high banks of the river made it hard for him to climb out quickly. The ground team, following the pilot's signals, came around the bend of the river. There he was, the mad trapper. He was about 300 yards away. He saw the police sleds coming. He saw the plane circling overhead. He knew there was nowhere left to run. Albert Johnson didn't try to talk. He didn't try to surrender. He just dropped to his knees, dug a shallow trench in the snow, and raised his rifle. The police officers fanned out. They yelled for him to give up. Johnson fired. The shootout on the Eagle River was intense. Bullets were flying everywhere, kicking up sprays of ice and snow. Whop May, the pilot, was circling above, watching the whole thing. He later said it looked like a war scene. Johnson was hit, but he kept firing. He was hit again. He kept firing. Finally, a bullet severed his spine. The firing stopped. The officers waited. The wind howled over the ice. Slowly, carefully, they approached the body. Albert Johnson lay face down in the snow. He was dead. His body was a wreck. He was emaciated. He weighed less than 100 pounds. His face was sunken, his skin waxy from frostbite and starvation. He had practically eaten nothing for a month, yet he had outrun a team of well-fed men and dogs for 150 miles. But the mystery of the mad trapper did not end with his death. In fact, it only got deeper. When they searched his body, they found a few $1,000s in cash, a huge amount for 1932. They found some gold teeth in his pocket, which was strange. They found a compass, a knife, and some pills. But they did not find a single piece of identification. No wallet, no letters, no name. Albert Johnson was just a name he had given when he arrived. It was an alias. They took his fingerprints. They sent them to the FBI in America, to Scotland Yard in England, to police forces all over Canada. No match. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody knew why he had come to the Arctic. Nobody knew why he hated the police so much that he was willing to die rather than just talk to them about some beaver traps. For decades, theories ran wild. Was he a bank robber from Chicago hiding out? Was he a draft dodger from World War I? Was he a mentally unstable hermit? They exhumed his body, dug it up several times over the years to do DNA testing. Finally, in 2021, nearly 90 years after the shootout, a team of genetic investigators made a breakthrough. Using advanced DNA genealogy, they linked the mad trapper to a family in Sweden. His real name, they believe, was Patrick Ginter. But even with a name, we still do not have the why. We do not know what snapped in his mind. We do not know what darkness he was running from that made the frozen hell of the Canadian Arctic seem like a safe haven. What we do know is that for 48 days, one man waged a war against nature and the law. He survived explosions, starvation, and the bitter cold, fueled by a rage that kept him warm when the fire could not. He was the man who ate trees. He was the man who refused to break. And in the end, it took an army, an airplane, and a bullet to stop the ghost of the Rat River. So, if you are ever in the Yukon and you hear the wind howling through the canyons, just remember, Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the woods isn't the cold or the bears. It's a man who has nothing left to lose. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. I hope you're having a strange, dark, and mysterious day because today we are hitting the road for a classic piece of Americana, the vanishing hitchhiker legend. But this isn't the story your grandmother told you. This is a real-life, documented account from a lonely stretch of highway where the spectral and the physical world collided, leaving behind a terrifying mystery. This is the story of the vanishing hitchhiker of Route 12. Before we dive into the deep end of the mysterious, do me a favor. If you enjoy this type of content, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and let me know in the comments what city you are watching this video from. Your support helps me keep telling these strange, dark, and mysterious stories. Our story centers on a specific, desolate stretch of highway known as Route 12, winding its way through the rugged, sparsely populated mountains of upstate New York. It's a road notorious for its hairpin turns, thick fog, and a long, tragic history of fatal accidents. The specific incident we're focusing on occurred in the dead of winter, in the year 1985. Our protagonist is a man named James Donovan. James was a traveling salesman for a regional paper company, a job that kept him on the road constantly. He was a skeptical, pragmatic man, utterly grounded in reality. He was driving his beat-up Ford sedan, heading back toward Albany after a long, unsuccessful day trying to close a deal in a remote town near the Canadian border. It was nearly 11 o'clock p.m. The temperature was well below freezing, and a thick, unnatural fog had rolled in, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The radio was fading in and out, the static almost as loud as the distant whine of his engine. James was driving slowly, nervously peering through the misty beam of his headlights when he saw her. Standing on the shoulder of the road, directly illuminated by his high beams, was a young woman. She was clearly in distress. She was wearing a thin, pale blue formal dress completely inappropriate for the freezing weather. Her dark hair was wet, plastered against her pale face, and she was standing stiffly, her thumb out, shivering violently. She looked like she had wandered out of a high school prom and into a nightmare. James, despite his exhaustion and his common sense telling him not to stop on a dark, foggy road, couldn't leave her there. He slowed down, pulled the sedan onto the snowy shoulder, and rolled down the passenger window. The moment he saw her face up close, he felt a wave of profound unease. Her eyes were wide, dark, and fixed on him with an expression of pure, bone-deep terror. "Where are you going?" James asked, trying to sound friendly. The girl's voice was barely a whisper. "The bridge. I need to get to the old covered bridge, just up the road. Please, I have to get there now." Quote, James knew the bridge she meant. It was about 3 miles further down Route 12. It was an iconic, but very remote, landmark. "All right, hop in. You're freezing," he said, reaching across to unlock the passenger door. The girl quickly opened the door and slid into the seat. The moment she settled beside him, James was hit by an intense wave of cold. It was far colder than the outside air, a chilling, damp cold that seemed to radiate directly from her body. He pulled back onto the highway. "My name is James. What's yours?" "Eliza," she replied, her voice still thin and strained. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead on the road, watching the fog-shrouded path ahead. James tried to make small talk, asking her what she was doing out here, who she was with, and why she was wearing a summer dress. Eliza's replies were short, fragmented, and strange. She mumbled something about a terrible argument and having to leave. She kept repeating that she was late and that she had to warn them. As they drove, James noticed something else disturbing. Despite the overwhelming cold she exuded, there was no sign of condensation, frost, or even a single shiver visible on her skin. She was perfectly, chillingly still. He glanced down at his dashboard. The thermometer gauge was inexplicably climbing, not dropping. The interior of the car was getting hotter, yet the cold radiating from Eliza was making James's side of the car feel like a freezer. They had been driving for about 5 minutes when the fog suddenly thickened, becoming an opaque, blinding wall of white. James had to slow the car down to barely 10 miles per hour. "Almost there," Eliza whispered, her voice tightening with dread. "It's coming." "What's coming, Eliza? The bridge?" "No," she said, her voice now dangerously calm. The sound of the car hitting the guardrail. James's blood ran cold. The way she said it was not a prediction. It was a statement of fact, a memory. He realized the horror of the situation. He wasn't giving a ride to someone in trouble. He was giving a ride to someone who had already been in trouble. He slammed on the brakes, pulling the car to a shuddering halt in the middle of the empty highway. "Eliza, what are you talking about? Who are you?" he demanded, turning to face her. She finally looked at him. Her face was no longer pale. It was completely translucent, the color of milky glass. Her wide, dark eyes held an expression of infinite sorrow and regret. "I tried to tell them. I was supposed to be here," she said, her voice fading to a wispy echo. "But I ran. I never should have left the dance." Then, from the fog directly ahead of them, came a sound. It was the sickening, unmistakable sound of grinding metal, followed by the shattering noise of glass exploding.